Good morning and welcome to our coverage of a historic first. The Accession Council has its origins well before the Norman conquest of 1066. It takes some explaining, which we will endeavour to do, but it is to be televised for the first time this morning, which should be fascinating. Charles III became king at the moment of his mother's passing, which also perhaps does bear some explaining in terms of its common law origins. But he has known from birth that his reign would begin both in sorrow and in public. This morning's ceremony is all about the historic need for leaders to be seen from the start. Continuity keeps the crown alive. Well, today, King Charles III will be formally recognised and proclaimed at a gathering of the most senior figures in British life, present and past. After the briefest of periods out of the public gaze in the immediate aftermath of the news of the Queen's death at Balmoral, the new monarch was back in the spotlight. And on his return to London, the King has already begun to set the tone for his own reign, stopping his car before it entered the gates of Buckingham Palace to speak to those who had come with condolences for the loss of his mother ahead of last night's moving address.
As the Queen herself did with such unswerving devotion, I too now solemnly pledge myself, throughout the remaining time God grants me, to uphold the constitutional principles at the heart of our nation. And wherever you may live in the United Kingdom, or in the realms and territories across the world, and whatever may be your background or beliefs, I shall endeavour to serve you with loyalty, respect, and love, as I have throughout my life.
In the next hour, St James's Palace, just a 5 minutes walk from Buckingham Palace, of course, will hold an Accession Council to do just that. Throughout the ages, it has been the setting for some of the most important events in royal history, and it remains the home of the royal court. For the very first time, our cameras have been allowed in to witness the event, which will be attended by several hundred politicians, senior members of the clergy, and other high-ranking public servants. All are members of the Privy Council, a group appointed by the monarch to advise and sign off on new law. And in the grand tradition of announcing a new monarch, at 11 o'clock, the balcony outside St James's Palace will then be filled for a royal proclamation, the first since the Queen's reign began in 1952. Well, to guide us through the events of the next 3.5 hours, I'm joined by royal historians Bob Morris and Anna Whitelock and royal author Penny Jr. We'll get their thoughts very shortly. But first, Paul Brand is at St James's Palace, where the Accession Council and first proclamation of the new king will take place. Paul, talk us through the significance of what we're about to witness.
Morning, Tom. Well, before the days of rolling news and mobile phones, this was quite literally the original news flash, the way that news would have travelled by word of mouth that we had a new monarch. It's proclaimed here at St James's Palace first, but also in Scotland, in Wales, in Northern Ireland, proclamations across the cities, the counties and the parishes of the United Kingdom. In those days, of course, it might have taken days, even weeks, for everyone to learn that there was a new monarch. Nowadays, I doubt as if there is anyone in the United Kingdom who hasn't already heard that we have a new king. But this remains an important constitutional moment, the first official recognition that the king has ascended to the throne. And for the first time ever, we won't just witness what happens here on the balcony of St James's Palace, but what happens inside too, which will be televised.
Elizabeth Alexandra Mary is now, by the death of our late sovereign of happy memory, become Queen Elizabeth II, by the grace of God, Queen of this realm.
It is the moment state formally recognises sovereign. For centuries, the gallery outside St James's Palace has trumpeted each of the nation's new monarchs.
This is looking forward to the new reign. It needs to be pronounced to the world.
The new sovereign will make a personal declaration I mean, this is such an extraordinary historical occasion.
For the first time, we're going to hear those words, "God save the King," words that many of us have never heard before.
Few realise it, but St James's is actually the most important royal residence in the country. Just down the road from Buckingham Palace, it's largely ignored by tourists, despite being the setting for some of the most vital events in royal history.
St James's Palace was built by Henry VIII back in the 16th century, and for the next 300 years it was the home of monarchs in England. And then with Queen Victoria's reign, the royal residence moved primarily to Buckingham Palace, but this still remains officially where the royal court still is, the court of St James, and so it remains the principal ceremonial hub of the monarchy.
Today, for the first time, we've been invited in to see not just the historic ceremony outside, but the oaths and pronouncements inside these walls. In the gold-leafed reception rooms, the powerful of the past stare down from their picture frames. Eyes on the wall, about to witness a new chapter in history. Crammed in here will be the Accession Council, today's High Commissioners from the realms, as well as politicians, senior civil servants, clergy and royals on the Privy Council.
The Privy Council was established in the 13th century, and it is an advisory body to the monarch. They are there to bear witness to the fact that we have a new sovereign.
The throne that seated Queen Elizabeth II for so long will now see her son installed in her place. Here, the new king will make his declaration.
I think he will want stability, of course, for the monarchy and for our country, but I also think that he will want to reflect the changes in our country that have taken place.
The Accession Council is something that's never been seen in public before, though Queen Victoria did allow the artist Sir David Wilkie to capture hers.
The eyes of the world are watching St James's Palace in a way that's never really been seen before. The Queen's coronation way back in 1952 broke new ground in being televised for the first time, but now the events from today and the next 10 days are really going to be watched in real time globally.
Stowed carefully in a cupboard are the original proclamation documents, formalising each new monarch in writing. This is the headquarters of the country's heralds, whose job it is to maintain many of the ancient standards of British public life, like flying flags and coats of arms.
There has always been a proclamation, an accession proclamation. It is rendering public what has happened.
Clive Cheeseman is one of the officers of arms, the Richmond Herald, a steward of these scripts.
And the way it's written here, it feels momentous, doesn't it? There's a gravity to the language. I mean, this sentence, whereas it hath pleased Almighty God to call to his mercy our late sovereign, Lord King George VI, of blessed and glorious memory, by whose decease the crown is solely and rightfully come to the high and mighty Princess Elizabeth Alexandra Mary.
Yes, this is a big performative utterance. It's not about mourning the old monarch, though it does a bit of that. It's looking forward to the new reign. Flags are back at full mast for the period of the proclamations, so it has a different character.
So this isn't a moment of mourning necessarily, this is actually an important constitutional moment.
Precisely.
Once the formalities inside are complete, state trumpeters and a line of heralds will process outside to the proclamation gallery to publicly announce the new king.
Expectant crowds are going to be gathered. Everybody will be jostling for position to be here and say they were here for that moment when the new king is proclaimed.
Right there from that balcony.
Indeed.
We therefore, the Lord spiritual and temporal of this realm, publish and proclaim.
It was 1936 the last time a king was proclaimed in this courtyard. when George VI came to the throne.
God save the King!
Today, in the place which proclaimed both his grandfather and his mother, a long line continues as our new king begins his reign.
Well, there are many fascinating things about this morning, not least seeing many former prime ministers. We're told that former prime ministers Blair, Brown, Johnson and Cameron have already arrived. Pretty rare to have all of them in one room. Well, there's so much to set up about this. If you're into history or the royal family of anything, this is going to be a fascinating morning because boy, does it take some explaining. And I'm joined, as I said, by Bob, Anna and Penny, who are going to help me variously with the aspects of this. Bob, can we just start at the very beginning? Where does this have its origins? Pre-Norman conquest, is that correct?
Yes, all kings, all monarchs need advice, and they need a council of some kind or another. And this has gradually been formalised over the years to the situation we are in now. So the advisory group that the Saxon kings used was called the Witan, and that had powers of recognition and also selection, of course, which existed in the times before primogeniture was settled in this country as the way in which the king was chosen. So this is a powerful body even then, and it was continued essentially in one form or another for many, many years afterwards, and was adopted also by the Normans.
So we should clear up one thing, because I said at the start, let's be clear why one monarch is automatically, on the moment of death, in all that sadness, succeeded by the other. And the Accession Council, it's not a matter of choice, as it might have been in Saxon times. That's because that's developed over, that's common law that's developed over the centuries. Indeed,
and this was something that was evolved gradually over a period of time. The French were first to settle it. The Capetian monarchy settled this in the late 10th century and had automatic succession, uncontested, until the early 14th century and the beginning, of course, of what we call the 100 Years' War, because there was a contested selection. But in this country, primogeniture wasn't really established until the late 12th century, I think one could argue. Yeah. And the law has reinforced that situation. Originally by the declaration of the judges, what we know as the common law preceded statute law, which began really in the late period of Edward I's reign in the late 13th century. And as we regard it now as the dominant form of law, but the common law exists beside it still, because what was judged by the judges as a good law remains.
Anna, if we consider its origins are pre-Norman conquest, why do we still have it 1,000 years later? How has it developed over the intervening period?
I mean, this is a big day, and in a way, to understand modern Britain and the modern monarchy, we need to understand the history. And what we're going to see today and what we're going to hear today really, I suppose, dates back to the 17th century, so post-Tudors, and it's a point where Britain is threatened by Catholic Europe, so we need to understand that defence of Protestantism is important. And we need to understand that this dates from a period where the constitutional wings or the authority wings of the monarch were being clipped, and so there were constraints being put in. And some people might have heard of the Act of Union in 1707, which formalised England and Scotland coming together in Great Britain, and also the Bill of Rights, which clipped the wings and established this kind of constitutional quid pro quo between the monarch and Parliament. So what we're going to see today, first of all, is the Accession Council, made up of, today there'll only be about a couple of hundred. There's in fact about 600 or 700 Privy Councillors, former Cabinet Ministers. Basically anybody who's a Privy Councillor has the title Right Honourable. And I believe there was a ballot about who could be there today. And first the Accession Council is going to agree the proclamation. And this is basically proclaiming the title of the new king. Now we know he's Charles III. But in days before, this would be where that would be determined. We will also see in that proclamation the confirmation of the fact that Charles is head of the Commonwealth. That's not a hereditary position, that wasn't a given, but in 2012 at the CHOGM, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, the Queen expressed her desire that it be Charles and no other head of state that succeeded her, so we'll hear that too. And then it will be announced, as we heard, and this is where basically in the days gone by before TV and Twitter, people would actually know that there was a new king. And from there we move on to the Privy Council when the king will arrive.
OK, Penny, a big moment for the new king. This is his first chance to actually kind of address us as king. Yesterday he was very much talking about his mother.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, how many years has she been preparing for this? This is a speech, I think, that he writes himself. It will be from the heart. He has, you know, this is going to be the best prepared monarch this country's ever had. So it'll be very, very interesting to hear what he has to say. OK. Let's go put all that to Chris Shipp, our royal editor, who joins us from Buckingham Palace. Chris, we obviously talked last night about that address, the first time we had heard the new king addressing us as monarch. I think the consensus, the overwhelming consensus, seems to be that it was a very, very well-judged speech. But this is somewhat different, isn't it, the declaration today?
Yeah, you're right, Tom, and actually I think it would be hard for King Charles to top the speech that he made yesterday, which I think ticked every single box in terms of looking back and paying tribute to his mother, but also looking forward and articulating the kind of king that he's going to be. But, you know, today is all about proclaiming and declaring that we have a new king. Of course, we all know that now. We've known that since the announcement from Buckingham Palace on a Thursday evening. But this is a significant sort of historical moment. And I think Paul was just talking about the fact we haven't had one of these. Let's just remind ourselves, we haven't had one of these since 1952, and we haven't had a king declared at one of these since 1936. And there are so many Privy Councillors, as Anna was just saying, 700 or so. They're not all going to be able to fit in that room today. But we should point out there are two parts to the Accession Council, and these are quite key. One is declaring the death of the late Queen, and one is proclaiming the arrival of a new king. And then you'll get that very old-fashioned looking announcement on the balcony of St James's Palace looking into Friary Court. I mean, just the symbolism, the history, there's so much on here. I'll just give you one little update we've had from Buckingham Palace, Tom, about what the king will be doing after all of this happens. And then he's got a series of audiences at Buckingham Palace. The Archbishop of Canterbury is the first one at 2 o'clock, the Prime Minister and members of the Cabinet, all Privy Councillors, of course. Then at 3 o'clock, he's seeing the leaders of the opposition parties. 4 o'clock, he is receiving the Dean of Westminster at Buckingham Palace. A lot for the king to do on this very important day.
Well, Chris, thank you very much. A reminder there really of how the job crowds in immediately, a man mourning his mother, but you know, there is no escape from the fact that he is king, and there is an enormous amount of work to do with immediate effect. Well, let's not take our eye off why today's event is happening. The Queen's body remains in Balmoral, where she passed away. Our correspondent Emma Murphy is there for us. Emma, perhaps you could take us through what's happening there and what's going to happen.
Yes, so here at Balmoral, some of the senior royals remain in place. We understand that the Princess Royal, Princess Anne, and her children are here. The Duke of York, Prince Andrew, as well as his children, Beatrice and Eugenie, and also the Wessexes. Now, they are here in the palace where the Queen's coffin lies at rest. We understand that it is believed to be in the ballroom, a place where, as a younger woman, the Queen would have danced. As an older woman, she hosted many, many receptions. And during the course of today, we expect that they will open the palace doors so that members of staff who have worked here most of their lives will be able to come and pay their respects to the woman who was such a very significant part of their lives. Bear in mind that in this community, many people have worked here for generations of their families. And so there is a really close tie. And that's why the royal family felt it was so important that the doors were opened for these people to come to really have a moment to reflect on what the Queen has meant to them and how she has affected their lives over the years. Now, you can probably see behind me, we also have an awful lot of well-wishers coming from the local community. They've been coming here since the announcement was made, laying flowers, leaving messages, and just taking time to stop and think. I think it would be unsurprising if we didn't see any members of the royal family coming out to read these messages at some point in the coming days, just to take solace from the messages and the words that have been left for them.
OK, Emma, thank you very much indeed. Well, Today's proclamation is the first of a series of similar ceremonies that begin in London but ripple out across the UK and to all the 14 other realms in which Charles is now king. Many of us think of Buckingham Palace as the centre of royal power, but the home of the royal court is just along the Mall at St James's Palace. That's where the Accession Council will begin at 10 o'clock. Once it's completed, the principal proclamation will take place at 11 o'clock on the balcony overlooking Friary Court immediately outside. That's the first of today's proclamations. A second is due in the City of London to the east. That will take place at midday outside the Royal Exchange, which is next to the Bank of England. Tomorrow, there will be more proclamations with the Royal Heralds dispersing to the other 3 nations in the UK. We'll bring you live coverage of the events in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Speaking of the Bank of England, news today that the Monetary Policy Committee even has been postponed next week as a sign of respecting national mourning. Now, Rebecca Barry is at the site of today's second proclamation, a few miles east at the Royal Exchange in the City of London. Rebecca, perhaps you could talk us through what part the City of London plays and what we're expecting to see.
Yeah, well, as you can see, they are busily preparing here for a theatrical moment of real-life significance. The police are searching with sniffer dogs. The barriers are going up in readiness for the crowds here. Anyone who comes here today will be a first-hand witness to a spectacle that hasn't been seen for 7 decades. The processions that pass by here will be full of fanfare. There'll be the sound of drums and trumpeters, a carefully choreographed display. First, we'll see a ceremonial unit dressed in 17th century costume carrying swords and 12-foot pikes. Then we'll see a procession of officials, including the Lord Mayor of London, who will make their way here from Mansion House. They'll be joined by the heralds who will have made their way from St James's Palace, and they'll pass along here, past the crowds of people and up to the Royal Exchange, where that second proclamation will be made. But the crowds here will not just be witnessing a brilliant display of British pageantry. This is all about getting the word out. It's designed to be seen and heard, the message that King Charles III is our new and rightful king.
OK, Rebecca, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's move on to speak now to Chloe Keeley, who is at Green Park for us in the shadows of Buckingham Palace. Chloe, the crowds and the flowers do look to us as if they're really building up there now.
Yes, that's right. Where I'm standing now, Tom, is just a couple of minutes' walk from the palace. This rather peaceful corner of Green Park is where people are now being asked to come and leave their flowers. So all the way through yesterday, we saw people going up to the gates of Buckingham Palace and laying their flowers there. Well, overnight, they have all been moved here to Green Park, and they've actually been arranged into little islands so that people coming here can take their time to walk between them and look at the tributes and read the messages. And one thing that's really struck me this morning is just how many families are here today, people with young children. One dad I spoke to said that his sons have been learning about this in school over the past couple of days and seeing it on the news, and he wanted to bring them here to see it for themselves and to pay their tributes as a family. Well, one family who's travelled a long way to be here is standing right next to me. This is Vicky and Tim, and you've come with your 2-year-old sons. Where have you travelled down from today?
We travelled from East Yorkshire.
So what time did you get up to be here?
We got up at 4 a.m. this morning to leave.
And what made you feel you wanted to come down here?
I think for the boys, you know, you can't avoid, it's on the news, it's in the newspapers. Even at their age, they understand somewhat of what's happening. And we just thought we had the opportunity to come down and just be a part of the, of what's happening at the moment.
And Tim, can I just ask you, what did the Queen mean to you and your family?
It was just something. She was always there in our lives. You know, you look around on money and coins and stuff. She's always there. She's always been like the establishment of the country. She's always, been there.
Yeah. I can see your boys. Have you laid some flowers already?
Yeah, they've laid some flowers this morning. Did you put your flowers down?
What did you lay down?
You lay some pink flowers.
No.
What colour did you lay?
Did you lay some flowers for the Queen?
No, pink.
And
you're pink ones.
You're going to stay for the day?
Yeah, we're going to stay for the day. it's important to us that we sort of see what's happening and be a part of it.
Well, and I can say that just over the past couple of hours, the number of people here and the number of flowers has just kept growing. So I think that by the end of today, this corner of Green Park will look pretty extraordinary.
OK, Chloe, thank you very much indeed. Well, we've got our first pictures here from inside St James's Palace. And, you know, we said this is a historic first, but, you know, this is quite something. You can see James Cleverly, the new Foreign Secretary, just on the left of the picture there. There's David Cameron. Look, that's an extraordinary shot of the former Prime Ministers. John Major on the right of your screen, Theresa May, David Cameron, Boris Johnson, of course, Gordon Brown, Keir Starmer, I think, just to the left of him, on the left of the screen there. So unusual to really see these, I mean, you know, Bob, Anna and Penny, just chip in where you want here, but this is something we just don't see very often, is it really?
Yeah, I mean, one person we haven't mentioned yet, it's a big day for Penny Mordaunt, who's actually Lord President of the Council, newly Leader of the Commons, and she is going to have the main role here, chairing the Council and reading the proclamation, or actually asking a senior civil servant, clerk of the council, to read the proclamation. And she will then also lead us through this first part. She will then order guns to be fired at the Tower of London and Hyde Park, and then make the arrangements and order that the proclamation is read out through the city and in Belfast, Cardiff and Edinburgh. So it's a really big day for her. We should also say, of course, that members of the royal family will be there, Camilla, William, and traditionally, those who gathered would be there in quite formal dress with decorations and so on. So they're relatively dressed down here. And yeah, look, everybody's very expectant for the arrival of Penny Mordaunt and Lord President.
Well, look, I mean, this is everyone who used to run Britain and everyone who does run Britain all in one room. I'm not sure, can't remember whether I've ever seen a sort of shot like this. I mean, just for the sheer fascination of watching all these prime ministers, of course, those three Tories on the right there, Boris Johnson, David Cameron, Theresa May, agonising small talk, you'd think, given that they have absolutely nothing in common and don't particularly like each other. But, you know, this is I mean, Bob, see, the point of this historically is that this was a way of everyone who was meaningful in the country saying that they supported the new king or queen.
Absolutely, and to recognise the succession. Also not mentioned, there are also present in the group here some senior judges. And one has to remember the Privy Council still has a judicial committee which dispenses justice, including in some of the realms.
That's an important point too, to say, of course, the judiciary is independent, and whilst the cabinet will then have to swear an oath to the new monarch, the senior judges won't. It's also true to say that this is, of course, an occasion significant for those 14 other countries where our king is now head of state. And
these are moments we're not going to forget. This is, you know, Gordon Brown apparently laughing and joking with Boris Johnson on the left. I mean, things you probably thought you would never see. We've seen various other kind of Michael Howard we saw at the back just a moment ago chatting animatedly. We've seen virtually every other member of the cabinet. I mean, perhaps we should explain, how does one become a member of the Privy Council, and thus why are all these people gathered in this room?
Yes, well, it's something that happens automatically for the senior cabinet members, the Secretaries of State and others. Of course, the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Lord Chancellor. And it's sometimes awarded to senior backbenchers as a recognition of their service. You remain a member, which is partly the problem, that they have almost 700, as Anna mentioned. And so there's had to be a ballot, I think, as well as some fierce selection.
Right.
Why is the Prime Minister not there?
Well, I imagine the Prime Minister is about to arrive.
Prime Minister will
The
Prime Minister will arrive. And also the High Commissioners of those other countries, the realms, have been invited. Not all of them may well be there, but they will. And here is the beginning of the occasion. And just, I mean, this has been going on for centuries. But there's the Archbishop of Canterbury, there's the Prime Minister. It's the first time it's been televised. The Queen broke ground, of course, having her coronation televised, and here the new King also breaking ground. And there is, big day, Lord President of the Council, Penny Mordaunt, followed by the Queen Consort.
and the Royal Dukes.
And the new Prince of Wales, of course, who's just, been given the title.
He doesn't attend this part, he attends the next part. And in the next part, it is only Privy Councillors who attend.
The business
so, for example,
part one of the Council. My Lords, it is my sad duty to inform you that Her Most Gracious Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, has passed away on Thursday, the 8th of September, 2022, at Balmoral Castle. I propose that, when certain necessary business has been transacted, a deputation consisting of Her Majesty, His Royal Highness, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Lord Chancellor, the Archbishop of York, the Prime Minister, the Clerk of the Council, and myself, shall wait on the King and inform him the Council is assembled. I now call on the Clerk of the Council to read aloud the text of the proclamation.
Whereas it has pleased Almighty God to call to His mercy our late Sovereign Lady, Queen Elizabeth II, of blessed and glorious memory, by whose decease the crown of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland is solely and rightfully come to the Prince Charles Philip Arthur George. We, therefore, the Lords spiritual and temporal of this realm, and members of the House of Commons, together with other members of Her late Majesty's Privy Council, and representatives of the realms and territories, aldermen and citizens of London and others, do now hereby, with one voice and consent of tongue and heart, publish and proclaim that the Prince Charles Philip Arthur George is now, by the death of our late sovereign of happy memory, become our only lawful and rightful liege lord, Charles III, by the grace of God of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and of his other realms and territories, King, head of the Commonwealth, defender of the faith, to whom we do acknowledge all faith and obedience with humble affection, beseeching God, by whom kings and queens do reign, to bless His Majesty with long and happy years to reign over us. God save the King!
God save the King!
Well, there we are. The first time we have
I
ever
now
been
invite
allowed
those
as a
on the
nation
platform
to witness that.
to
Sorry, let's just
sign
hear what
the
Penny Morton has to
proclamation.
say further. So she was just inviting the members of the council to sign. The Prince of Wales, the new Prince of Wales, Prince William, is signing first. We expect the Queen Consort to sign second, followed by the other members. Now, the platform party, key members of, I don't know what you would, I mean, would you call it the establishment? I don't quite know what the correct term is, but some of the most people in key figures in the country, the Archbishop of Canterbury, of course, you probably recognise, the Archbishop of York, but also the Lord Great Chamberlain, head of the royal household, not a figure well known, but actually has proved a very powerful position at points in the last 10 years, responsible for the running of the royal household. So we're just going to witness the members of the platform party, the Prime Minister, of course, stepping up to sign now.
Just to be clear, I mean, this is a document that will be read by historians for years. I often go to the archives and look back on old proclamations with signatures faded at the bottom. And this is a new document being made, cast in that image. It's really quite incredible to see.
So how much does it vary?
It's very standard. What the Lord President there declared, the words, and then the proclamation, very, very standard words. They probably sounded a bit odd to people. The reference to Lord Spiritual and Temporal, that's basically the church and the state. And there we have the Archbishop of Canterbury, and also the important role for members of the City of London, the Lord Mayor and the Aldermen who run the city. So this was the old chief ministers, government officials, or chief members of the establishment, as you say here, signing. And after this, the Lord President will order that the proclamation is read out across London and then across the capitals of the other nations. And it will be a kind of the start of a verbal beacon, if you like, a lighting of beacons to proclaim proclaim the passing of the Queen and the accession of the new King.
The television had one interesting effect. It's a much more orderly procedure than it has been in the past, where the Lord President has had a call for quiet and so on and so forth. And as Anna was saying, I mean, the most senior official representatives sign first. All the members present also sign at but a rather later time of the day. So at one point, everybody scrambled to sign the wordings of the proclamation, which was, of course, settled by the cabinet first before it appeared here. The earliest version I've seen, Anna may have seen earlier ones, is 1625, and the wording is almost exactly the same.
Okay, well, Penny Mordaunt, you may recognise from the Tory Leadership Challenge, who is Leader of the House of Commons, which is why she's in this position, is going to speak again here.
1. Ordering the proclamation to be printed and published in specialist supplements in the London, Edinburgh and Belfast Gazettes. 2. Directing the Lord Chancellor to affix the Great Seal to the proclamation proclaiming His Majesty King Charles III. 3. Directing the kings, heralds and pursuivants of arms to attend at the Court of St. James to proclaim His Majesty King Charles III. 4. Directing the Lord Mayor, the Court of Aldermen and Commons of London to attend at the Royal Exchange to proclaim His Majesty King Charles III. 5. Directing His Majesty's Secretary of State for Defence to give directions for the firing of guns at Hyde Park as soon as His Majesty is proclaimed. 6. Directing the Constable of His Majesty's Tower of London to give directions for the firing of guns at the Tower of London as soon as His Majesty is proclaimed. 7. Directing His Majesty's Secretary of State for Scotland to cause the proclamation for proclaiming His Majesty King Charles III to be published in Scotland. 8. Directing the Clerk of the Council to issue circular letters for causing His Majesty King Charles III to be proclaimed are hereby approved. And that concludes the business for this part of the Council. I now invite the deputation party to accompany me to wait on the King in the Council chamber.
Bob, just talk us through the next stage that we're going to witness here.
Well, the King, the Privy Council meeting will now turn into Privy Council par excellence, as it were. It's the first meeting that the King, of course, will preside at. He will make a personal declaration, which is usually quite affecting. It normally has three parts. Regret at, of course, the departure of his mother. Secondly, a ringing declaration of fidelity to the Constitution. And thirdly, a humble request for the assistance of everyone in the nation as he carries out his difficult duties. It can be quite an affecting speech, and it will reinforce some of the remarks he was making yesterday in his speech to the nation.
So there we are, a remarkable shot. The Speaker of the House of Commons, if you're looking along that line there, former Tory Prime Minister John Major, of course, former Tory Prime Minister Theresa May, former Tory Prime Minister David Cameron, former Tory Prime Minister Boris Johnson, former Labour Prime Minister Gordon Brown, and my eyes beginning to fail me on the left of screen, but somewhere on the left of screen, Tony Blair, and of course the current leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer. Very, very unusual, not unique, but unusual to see them all gathered in the same room, so close together. The purpose here to give their approval, acclamation to the new king, King Charles III.
And their work now is done because the Privy Council is made up of the cabinet. So these people will file out. We'll also have glimpsed as Jacob Rees-Mogg, who was until the new government was established, Lord President of the Council, so would have been playing this role. We also glimpsed Nicola Sturgeon. So these people will file out, and it will be now the first Privy Council, as Bob said. And of course, the Privy Council meets every month with the monarch to advise. And again, it's this age-old body, the Privy Council, and that marks the sort of formal beginning of the reign. And after the personal declaration that Bob mentioned, we're going to see an oath to uphold the independence of the Church of Scotland, which was a promise made when the Act of Union was being formed, that the King would protect the independence of the Protestant Church.
Okay, you just saw Yvette Cooper, Ian Duncan Smith, Jacob Rees-Mogg just going out of frame there. You will recognise many of these people from public life. Nick Clegg, of course, the former Deputy Prime Minister, and now works for Meta. Haven't seen him in public for a while. Robert Jenrick just behind him. So you can see Ben Wallace just at the back of frame, the current Defence Secretary. So pretty much everyone you've known and loved or otherwise in British public life of the last 20, 30 years in this room to witness, to acclaim the new king. Quite remarkable scenes, the first time we've ever seen them on television. And just really, really intriguing. Penny, can I just bring you in here? What does King Charles himself, do you think, make of all this sort of ancient tradition?
Well, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, to see this with the language that goes back centuries, and yet we're living in a world where news is round the world within an instant, with Twitter and Facebook and all these things. It's such a sort of, such a contrast.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I think the king is very much a traditionalist. I mean, I don't think he uses a computer, and I think he absolutely believes in all this pomp and ceremony. I think he thinks it's an important part of the monarchy and the job that he does.
And Anna, is it? I mean, does this actually serve a purpose in your view? I mean, if you were an American watching this, or Angela Rayner, just the deputy leader of the Labour Party, just going through it, but if you're an American watching all of this, or from France, you're here watching the former Tory leader William Hague just shuffle through frame, all these people who've dominated public life in one room. People in other democracies must think, well, this is just curious beyond curious. But does it serve a purpose, do you think?
Well, for some, I mean, it explains where we are now and why Britain runs as it does and why we have a constitutional monarchy and where it comes from. Now, for some people, this will be exactly the reason why we need to move on and change things. Because, of course, the King is going to swear to uphold the independence of the Church of Scotland. That really isn't necessary anymore. There's been a Church of Scotland Act. There's also, by the European Human Rights Convention, he couldn't just override that. He also still has to, by the Bill of Rights and subsequent acts, to exceed the English throne, he has to be a Protestant. So in a sense, this is about turning his back in terms of promise on other faiths, when of course that goes against actually what Charles is all about, which is about being a supporter of multi-faith. So it jars in a way. But I mean, this is kind of, as a historian, certainly it's kind of tingle time.
As a lifelong history enthusiast, this is just quite something to witness. Bob, where are we now? We're at the heart of St James's Palace, this ancient royal palace.
Right, they're now got into the throne room, only the Privy Councillors. It's a ceremony of affirmation and of recognition. And it binds the parts of our constitution together in one particular and symbolic occasion, where the king is the centre of attention. But in a regime where really, we are, as much as anything, a republic who happens to have an hereditary head of state. And that gives us some advantages in the way in which the country can run.
We're also going to see the beginning of the sort of transition. So after he's made his personal declaration, he will also say that the offices of state, the seal, which can continue of the late Queen until new seals, which sign and make law formalised by Act of Parliament, those can continue. And what we'll also hear is arrangements for the lying of state and the funeral. This is still, this is him waiting for the king to come.
Sorry, having spent a great deal of my life covering politics, this is one of those moments where you just wish you had a sort of boom microphone so you could hear what Tony Blair and Keir Starmer, who've just been chatting animatedly on the left of screen, are saying to each other here. Not to mention, as I said, the various Tory prime ministers who have absolutely no time for each other, how they're making small talk. It's a bit like when the opening of the House of Commons and the leader of the opposition and the prime minister make this procession together, and you just think, oh, the small talk must be agonising, really. But can I just clear up one point? We talked about common law. Common law, I mean, I know this is my grotesque oversimplification, but it's kind of custom and practice that's built up over the years, and that's why we pass automatically from one monarch to another. But of course, we famously, 100 years before the French, had a very dramatic revolution. We tried the king not far from here. We executed Charles's namesake. We had a republic, not very happily, one might argue, for quite a few years. Was essentially the act of oblivion when the monarchy was restored. It just struck all that out in terms of how the process works.
It struck all out, except what had been approved by Charles I. And he'd approved quite a lot, actually. I mean, he'd approved the legislation which effectively ended the feudal system, for example, land tenure and so on. And so it wasn't the sort of rubbing out that the Cavalier Parliament might have entirely liked. But of course there was the decision to pursue 50 people as traitors, and they were overwhelmingly the people who signed the warrant for the death of Charles I in 1649. But it's a healing occasion also. I mean, we talk about, we can see this as politicians of different sides speaking together and so on and so forth. It's a manifestation of the nation, and at a time of change.
I mean, I sometimes think, when I wander around Westminster, of the utter high drama of those years, family against family, the nation split in half, having to design this whole new concept of the sovereignty of the people effectively in order to try the king in the first place. And I know we talked about this yesterday, but as we look at kind of these politicians, chatting to each other, is part of the reason why, we don't sort of like to think of a republic very often, because somewhere in the dim, distant recorded memory we tried it and we think it's a bit of a disaster, or do you think that plays no part whatsoever anymore?
We have a bit of amnesia, or when we come to our history about the republic, we don't really think about it. There's a statue, of course, of Cromwell outside Parliament, but it's not really talked about. I mean, we did, kill our king ahead of many, many other countries, and we do feel a little bit queasy about it. But I mean, looking at this, I'm also just struck by the fact, what a week this has been. I mean, it was only on Monday that the new leader of the Conservative Party, new Prime Minister, was then appointed by the late Queen. And, within a matter of days, we now have a new monarch. I mean, this is a moment, a seminal moment in history, and it may be in decades' time people look back and see this as the beginning of the end of monarchy, or they might see this being its rebirth for the 21st century in a different form, which we're not yet clear about. But the chit-chat, the small talk goes on here.
Well, Keir Starmer making some animated points to his predecessor, although I think, considerably more interested to hear perhaps what small talk Gordon Brown and Boris Johnson are making there. Two politicians you would think did not have did not have a great deal in common. Penny, we're waiting for the new king to come in here. We've discussed the declaration, chants for him. I mean, you know him as well as any commentator. You've written some of the seminal books on him. Any thoughts as to how he's going to be thinking at this point? Any clues as to what you reckon might be in this declaration?
Well, I suppose the matter of faith is one that this might be the moment to declare. He's famously let it be known that he would ideally be a defender of faith, of all faiths, rather than just the Church of England. I mean, and throughout the years, he has been bringing faiths, people of different faiths together. I think he's a very cohesive sort of man. I think he's going to be the most interesting king, actually. Having spent all of these years gaining the knowledge that he has, the understanding all these things, he's had time, you've got a new Prime Minister coming in and, she's suddenly bounced into absolutely everything all at once, the economy, the cost of living, everything. And now she's got this to deal with. But this is something that he has been thinking about, one imagines, for decades.
The personal declaration, though, I mean, this isn't like a big speech that he's had to kind of come up with that was perhaps more what yesterday was about. I mean, this is pretty well structured. Regret at the passing of the late Queen. As Bob said earlier, a promise to kind of uphold constitutional government, to ask for support in doing that. So, and then a little bit, perhaps, which will indicate what's fundamental to his kingship. And I think Penny's right that it will be very much about faith. I mean, history is awkward sometimes. We're going to see the new king coming in just a second, and Penny mentioned Defender of Faith. Of course, the awkwardness is that was a title given to Henry VIII by the Pope, in fact.
Okay, here we go. This is the moment the Prime Minister's come in. We're waiting now for the new king.
Business for Part 2 of the Council. Your Majesty, to make your declaration.
My lords, ladies and gentlemen, it is my most sorrowful duty to announce to you the death of my beloved mother, the Queen. I know how deeply you, the entire nation, and I think I may say the whole world, sympathize with me in the irreparable loss we've all suffered. It is the greatest consolation to me to know of the sympathy expressed by so many to my sister and brothers, and that such overwhelming affection and support should be extended to our whole family in our loss. To all of us as a family, as to this kingdom and the wider family of nations of which it is a part, my mother gave an example of lifelong love and of selfless service. My mother's reign was unequaled in its duration, its dedication and its devotion. Even as we grieve, we give thanks for this most faithful life. I am deeply aware of this great inheritance and of the duties and heavy responsibilities of sovereignty, which have now passed to me. In taking up these responsibilities, I shall strive to follow the inspiring example I have been set in upholding constitutional government and to seek the peace, harmony and prosperity of the peoples of these islands and of the Commonwealth realms and territories throughout the world. In this purpose, I know that I shall be upheld by the affection and loyalty of the peoples whose sovereign I have been called upon to be, and that in the discharge of these duties, I will be guided by the counsel of their elected parliaments. In all this, I am profoundly encouraged by the constant support of my beloved wife. I take this opportunity to confirm my willingness and intention to continue the tradition of surrendering the hereditary revenues, including the Crown Estate, to my government for the benefit of all, in return for the sovereign grant, which supports my official duties as head of state and head of nation. And in carrying out the heavy task that has been laid upon me, and to which I now dedicate what remains to me of my life, I pray for the guidance and help of Almighty God.
I have with humble duty to crave your Majesty's permission for the publication of your gracious speech.
Approved.
Concerning the security of the Church of Scotland.
I understand that the law requires that I should, at my accession to the Crown, take and subscribe the oath relating to the security of the Church of Scotland. I am ready to do so at this first opportunity. I, Charles III, by the grace of God of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and of my other realms and territories, King, Defender of the Faith, do faithfully promise and swear that I shall inviolably maintain and preserve the settlement of the true Protestant religion as established by the laws made in Scotland in prosecution of the claim of right, and particularly by an act intituled An Act for Securing the Protestant Religion and Presbyterian Church Government, and by the acts passed in the Parliament of both kingdoms for union of the two kingdoms, together with the government, worship, discipline, rights and privileges of the Church of Scotland. So help me God.
I now invite your Majesty to subscribe both copies of the instrument, confirming the oath has been taken. I now invite the witnesses to His Majesty's oath to sign both copies of the instrument.
We're witnessing the signing ceremony here. Brandon Lewis, the Lord Chancellor, signing. We've just seen the Queen Consort and the new Prince of Wales signing. Penny and I both noting in the studio here that William was left-handed, which, I mean, small, trivial moments. Did you know you wrote a book about him, Penny? Did you know he was left-handed?
I wrote it. I might have done.
Yeah.
Significant to reflect here on the importance of Scotland and the presence
Well, yes, I was
of
just going to say,
Scotland
can
in
you
all
just
this.
remind us of the importance of the oath to respect the security of the Church of Scotland and, of course, you know, Scottish English, well, there's Nicola Sturgeon stepping up, so it's a good moment to talk about it.
Indeed, I mean, there's a separation of church and state in Scotland. Of course, the King is obviously King of Scotland, but important to therefore recognise the independence of the Protestant Church. I mean, these are, you know, historical but very sort of resonant moments here. Nicola Sturgeon recognising that the King has acknowledged the independence of the Scottish Church. Not quite enough for her, of course. She would like recognition coming down the line of recognition of independence entirely. But yes, I mean, the relationship, of course, that we're still thinking about between England and Scotland, you know, dates back, well, 1603, when the King of Scotland came to England, James VI, and then first, and then, of course, the Act of Union of 1707.
But the Act, of course, was a result of a negotiation. And an important part of the negotiation, as Anna's saying, is the fact that the Scots wanted the independence of their particular form of Presbyterian Protestantism to be upheld. The King himself, of course, has to be a member of the Church of England.
Still, even to this day, rather a controversial negotiation, one might say. But anyway.
Indeed.
Yes.
And a very hard-fought one. It's a very interesting way of doing it.
OK.
Draft of an order in Council authorising Your Majesty's declaration to be made public.
Approved.
Draft of an order in Council for recording the oath relating to the security of the Church of Scotland, to be transmitted to the Court of Session, to be recorded in the books of Sediment, and afterwards lodged in the State Papers of Scotland and in the Council Register.
Approved.
Draft order in Council determining the form of proclamation for proclaiming Your Majesty in the realms and in the British Overseas Territories.
Approved.
Draft of an order in Council authorising the Lord Chancellor to make use of the Great Seal for sealing all things whatsoever that pass the Great Seal until another Great Seal be prepared and authorised.
Approved.
Draft of an order in Council authorising the Lord Privy Seal, if need be, to make use of the existing Privy Seal until another Privy Seal is prepared and authorised.
Approved.
Drafts of 3 orders in Council authorising Your Majesty's principal Secretaries of State, the Lord Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, to use the existing seals until other seals be prepared and authorised.
Approved.
Draft of an order in Council authorising Your Majesty's Secretary of State for Northern Ireland to make use of the existing Great Seal of Northern Ireland until another seal be prepared and authorised.
Approved.
Draft of an order in Council authorising Your Majesty's First Minister of Scotland to make use of the Great Seal of Scotland until another Great Seal of Scotland be prepared and authorised.
Approved.
Draft of an order in Council authorising Your Majesty's First Minister of Wales to make use of the existing Welsh Seal until another Welsh Seal be prepared and authorised.
Approved.
Draft of an order in Council authorising the public seals authorising the respective public seals lately in use elsewhere than in the United Kingdom to be made use of until new seals be prepared and their use duly authorised.
Approved.
Draft of an order in Council confirming Your Majesty's wishes in relation to the Sovereign Grant Act 2011 to continue the tradition of surrendering the hereditary revenues, including the Crown Estate, to your government for the benefit of all, in return for the sovereign grant, which supports your official duties as head of state and head of nation.
Approved.
Drafts of 2 proclamations. 1. Appointing the day of Her late Majesty's state funeral as a bank holiday in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. 2. Appointing the day of Her late Majesty's state funeral as a bank holiday in Scotland. And of 2 orders in Council directing the Lord Chancellor to affix the Great Seal to the proclamations.
Approved.
I now invite Your Majesty to sign both proclamations. And that, Your Majesty, concludes today's business for the Council.
Well, there we have it. There is so much to discuss there. The new king must be quite a strange moment when you sign a document thinking that for hundreds of years. Let's just hear sort of finally what the President has to say.
Gallery and the matted hall.
Okay, that was just asking people to leave. So, yes, I was just saying, you know, signing a document as king, knowing that for hundreds of years people will be pulling this document out, and looking at your signature, you had the new Prince of Wales, Prince William, with the first-hand
Privy Councillors
view.
Present
An heir doesn't always get that
via the
as to
gallery
what all
and the
this is
matted
about.
hall, and invite you to sign the proclamation, which is laid out in the lower corridor. Thank you all for attending today.
Penny Mordaunt, the Leader of the House of Commons, fulfilling her duties now, and all of the Privy Councillors, as we've been discussing, the great and good of politics, past and present. Alex Salmond, you can see in the middle of the frame there. We've seen Nicola Sturgeon sign the document. We've seen all the living former Prime Ministers in the front row, chatting with each other. You will have seen many, many people you recognise from the politics of the last 30 years, not to mention various other judges. There's James Cleverly on the right there, beginning to file out. Our new Foreign Secretary, William Hague, just on the very left of frame, bobbing in and out. Chris Grayling, I think, in the middle there, very tall. It really was quite a remarkable thing to witness. I'm not sure Nicola Sturgeon, there we see in the side corridor that Anna was, you know, just talking about the complicated relationship between, I mean, as the historians here, is there anything about what we just witnessed that surprised you or you weren't expecting or was slightly different?
Well, I think one of the things to notice is how they, in all the language about the new king, there was an emphasis placed on his role as head of the nation. I think that's new in its emphasis, and something that has developed in recent years in the way in which the monarch is regarded, certainly by officials and the government. There's also an absence of something there. There's no longer an order about royal prayers, because that was eradicated by the 1974 piece of legislation which conferred greater autonomy on the Church of England in liturgical and related matters.
It's also important to note that, obviously women are there. The new king referred to the ladies gathered as well as gentlemen. That wouldn't have always been the case. It would have been entirely male preserve before. So that's a signal of the change of women playing a part in public life over the last few decades.
Yes, and as you commented, Tom, I mean, the dress is much less formal than it used to be. Harold Macmillan had to wear court dress, which he hired from a firm of theatrical costumiers.
Lord, is that the case? Well, is he in Blackford signing now? Just Andrea Leadsom just waiting her turn. We just saw Kwasi Kwarteng, the new Chancellor, signing. Ed Miliband is just, former leader of the Labour Party, is just waiting behind there next to Angela Rayner. It's James Cleverly again coming down the stairs. So it's just one after another. The key politicians of this country, I guess what they're saying is, we accept, we support, we affirm that we have a new king. Penny, just as we're watching Ed Miliband sign here, it was really noticeable to me that once again it's hard not to find this endearing, right, that he keeps referring to his darling wife and references her at every point, making it clear this is a joint project. He relies on her support. I thought that was intriguing that he referred to her again here.
Yes, no, I absolutely agree with you. I've always thought that Charles himself is not the most confident of men. He had a difficult upbringing. He didn't feel particularly treasured by his parents at times when he was a child. They weren't always there. For whatever reason, he didn't have that sort of bedrock of confidence that comes, I think, from being totally loved and feeling secure. And I think that throughout his life, he's gone from one. Throughout his marriage to Diana, he had no support there from her. He's a man who I think has desperately needed someone to. He's a sensitive man. He needs strength from someone else.
Some people might have seen him actually mutter under his breath when he'd finished reading the Declaration. He sort of went, "Am I done?" And there's a sense that this is not without effort. And I think we saw that last night in the close-ups. His eyes were filled with tears. This is a strain, isn't it?
Cool. Chris has been watching all this with us. Well, not with us, but not in the studio, but he has been watching. Chris, can I just bring you in here? What have you made of what you've seen this morning?
Tom, where do you begin with what we've just witnessed? It is not often that we see that kind of thing happen and paying such great attention to every small detail of a meeting of this kind. And also a reminder of quite how many Privy Councillors there are. Just look at those pictures there. If the new king were ever to be in need of advice, he's not short of it, is he? There's more than 700 Privy Councillors where he'd need to call on them. A couple of things I will remark on. I completely agree with what you've just been discussing in the studio about the reference to his darling wife Camilla, and I refer back to that masterstroke of the late Queen on Accession Day, or perhaps we should now refer to it as the former Accession Day, on the 6th of February earlier this year, when she said that she wanted her daughter-in-law to be the Queen Consort. It's kind of smoothed everything, and as you just said, it means that this will be a reign of two people, a reign of Charles and of Camilla as well. And as ever, there was plenty of symbolism there. We've been told by a royal source that the ink pot on the table was a gift from Princes William and Harry, and that was chosen by the King for that very, very special moment. And interesting as well, Tom, to see, I think that's the first time we've seen the King, the Queen Consort, and the heir to the throne, the newly entitled Prince of Wales, all together in the throne room there at St James's Palace. So, wow, quite a meeting, wasn't it?
It really was quite a meeting, actually. I don't know what I expected from this morning, but I have to say I think all of us in the studio here were completely spellbound as we've We've just seen David Cameron walking down the stairs. We're now watching former Prime Minister, very recently former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, of course, was one of the last people, the relatively small group of people, the last people to see the Queen alive before she incredibly sadly, passed when he went up to indicate that he was relinquishing the office of Prime Minister, and just before she asked Liz Truss to become her new and last Prime Minister. Ian Duncan Smith, the former leader of the Tory party, signing there. Gordon Brown, just a former Prime Minister, just waiting behind him. Yvette Cooper just behind former Prime Minister Brown. Chris, can I just ask you one other thing that really struck me from the speech? It's the second time that in 24 hours that the new king has referred to what remains of my life. And now, on one level, that's totally unsurprising and just honest and sort of shows a degree of humility that he is in his 70s. But it just surprised me a bit. Did it surprise you at all that he's used that phrase twice?
Well, I suppose we should refer back here, Tom, to that speech that the late Queen Elizabeth gave in 1947 when she said, "Be my life long or short, I shall be devoted to your service." He's obviously found a form of words, and it was, the form of words he had in his address yesterday they made from Buckingham Palace was for the duration of the time or the remaining time that God grants me. And again, I think it's an acknowledgement here that this is he's the oldest ever king or oldest ever monarch to reach the throne at age 73. We're talking about a different kind of reign, and of course we shouldn't be looking ahead to the length of it at this very early stage, Tom, but it is an acknowledgement that we have a 73-year-old monarch, and a reminder of the difference of when this Accession Council last sat. The new monarch then was just 25 years old. In fact, she wasn't even there for part one of the Accession Council because famously she was in Kenya. So I think a reminder once again of the difference, of the changing of reigns, the changing of eras that we're experiencing in 2022 compared to the one the country last experienced in 1952.
And yes, sir.
Closing the door on abdication.
Okay, that's interesting.
Because it means that he intends to go for the whole period of his natural life.
Okay, I would not have read that. That was what you read into that.
But that's what I read into that. And that shuts the door, as I say, on the notion that he might be open to abdication as he ages.
One of the things, and I may be wrong about this, but I've always understood that one of the reasons why no monarch ever wants to abdicate is because of the common law principle, because an abdication would require Parliament to get involved. Is that right?
That's absolutely right.
And no monarch wants that because then there are a whole load of other questions.
Well, it's a conflict with the hereditary principle.
Yeah, and the basic simplicity of the common law principle, I guess. Chris, can I just bring you in on one other thing? Because Anna mentioned that the new king seemed to sort of, say, are we done under his breath, quite understandably, at the end. And it's just a reminder that things crowd in very, very fast. For the country, it's been a massive period of sadness, of adjustment, of mourning as we get used to the idea that the Queen is no longer with us. But for the king, he's got all of that, suddenly having days, full of stuff he has to do, and he's just lost his mother.
Yeah, and actually I'm struck by the speed with which everything is happening as well. Of course, the Accession Councils was always scheduled to happen the day after the death of the sovereign. It's slightly delayed, of course, because of the announcement on Thursday evening. But, just the announcement last night that Prince William will become the Prince of Wales, there's a lot of speed happening very, very quickly. And I think that's, and we won't obviously have a date for the coronation for some time, but I can tell you this time, it's not going to be 18 months after the accession as it was for the late Queen. And the other point we should pick out there is that we've had confirmation that the day of the funeral, although we don't know the date of it, but we know that the day of the funeral will be a public holiday. That was announced at the end of the part 2 of the Accession Council there in all 4 nations of the United Kingdom. That's a question I have to say I've been getting a lot from people. Will the Queen's funeral day be a public holiday? We now have had that confirmation that it will be. What day it's going to happen, we're likely to get that later today.
OK, Chris, thank you very much for now. Well, let's return to just outside St James's Palace, the scenes you're witnessing on your screens, and Paul Brand is there. Paul, you know, we should explain, this is the moment when previous generations would find out they had a new monarch, right? This was before social media, before news media, before any of that. This is how you learned you had a new king or queen.
That's right, Tom, and you can see people in the crowd here all holding their phones aloft. They all want to capture this moment, but this was the pre-mobile phone news flash, if you like. This was the moment that the news would be announced to people who had absolutely no idea centuries ago that there was a new monarch, because of course there was no television, there wasn't even newspapers in the day when this proclamation ceremony first began. So this really is the word of mouth moment where the nation will be told that the king had ascended the throne. And in just a few minutes' time, at 11 o'clock, we expect the heralds to walk out onto the balcony here at St James's Palace. There will be a fanfare, and then the proclamation will be read aloud to the public this time. Just a few hundred members of the public have been allowed through for security reasons. Of course, we've got former prime ministers here, we've got archbishops of Canterbury and York, all sorts of dignitaries, not least of all, of course, the king himself. So security is tight here, just a few hundred members of the public, lucky enough to be in Friary Court here to watch events on the balcony. And just off to my side is the slightly awkward political chemistry that you were watching in the room earlier, continuing out here onto the pavements. We've got cabinet members who were sacked on Tuesday chatting to cabinet members who were appointed on Tuesday. We've seen Boris Johnson just depart now. He seems to have left the proceedings for now. We've seen the great and good of political past and present as well. You mentioned some of them earlier. I've seen Peter Mandelson here today, and Nick Clegg, Michael Howard. So really all sorts of figures from the past 30 years. The First Minister of Wales just filed past me too. So they are now joining the crowds essentially and standing outside and watching this moment when they will walk out onto that balcony for the first time in 70 years, and we will all enjoy the moment, the only moment that's ever been witnessed in centuries gone by, which is that proclamation, the Garter King of Arms reading that proclamation, standing next to the heralds.
Well, Paul, it's an intriguing mix, isn't it, really, of the future and the past. You know, I felt like what we were witnessing in there, in those rooms, was the sort of ghosts of politics past. Obviously, some people, you know, Nick Clegg was so familiar as Deputy Prime Minister in the coalition. We actually haven't seen him very much recently. Peter Mandelson, as you say, Gordon Brown's Deputy Prime Minister, a Cabinet Minister under Blair before that. We haven't seen him very much in public life either. All these Prime Ministers chatting to each other, some of them quite animatedly, some quite surprising combinations. You know, Gordon Brown and Boris Johnson appearing to have a very animated and amused discussion, and one can only speculate what about. So it's a huge juxtaposition here, this sort of enormously sad moment for the country on one sense, but seeing a new king is just absolutely intriguing, watching the whole historical process play out and seeing it kind of take place amidst so much of the kind of past of public life being surrounding it. It's been extraordinary.
Yeah, and Tom, I found it quite interesting because it gives you a really rare insight into that constitutional interaction between monarchy and Parliament. That's not something we often see. Of course, at state openings of Parliament, we see the pomp and ceremony, but we very rarely hear those power dynamics between the two parts of our state, the two parts of our constitution. And I found it interesting watching Penny Mordaunt read that list of actions and to hear the King say agree as she was outlining what will be done in his name. A huge day for her, of course. She is the first woman actually to take part in that proclamation ceremony as Lord President of the Accession Council, to be announcing there the new king. No woman has ever done that in history before. Of course, the last time it was done was 70 years ago. There were very few women in Parliament at that point. So a huge responsibility for her. But now really, this is the moment for the crowds here outside St James's Palace. This is their moment to enjoy the very public proclamation that will take place any moment now on this balcony.
Well, here we are. We are witnessing the final moments as they file out, ready to make this proclamation, as we've been discussing already this morning. In centuries gone by, this would have been the moment that the country learned, pre-social media, pre-news media, pre-every other kind of media, this was how you learned that you had a new monarch.
Minute. Seconds.
Whereas it has pleased Almighty God to call to his mercy our late Sovereign Lady, Queen Elizabeth II, of blessed and glorious memory, by whose decease the crown of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland is solely and rightfully come to the Prince Charles Philip Arthur George. We, therefore, the Lords spiritual and temporal of this realm, and members of the House of Commons, together with other members of Her late Majesty's Privy Council, and representatives of the realms and territories, aldermen and citizens of London and others, do now hereby, with one voice and consent of tongue and heart, publish and proclaim that the Prince Charles Philip Arthur George is now, by the death of our late sovereign of happy memory, become our only lawful and rightful liege lord, Charles III. By the grace of God, of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and of his other realms and territories, King, head of the Commonwealth, defender of the faith, to whom we do acknowledge all faith and obedience with humble affection, beseeching God, by whom kings and queens do reign, to bless his majesty with long and happy years to reign over us. Given at St. James's Palace this 10th day of September in the year of our Lord, 2022. God save the King! God save the King! Three cheers for His Majesty the King. Hip, hip! Hooray! Hip, hip! Hooray! Hip, hip! Hooray! In charge will replace Hitler. Replace Hitler.
Well, there we have it, quite a moment in keeping with royal protocol and tradition going back centuries. The accession of King Charles III to the throne has been publicly proclaimed. As guns continue to fire across the capital, heralds will now carry the message to the nations of the United Kingdom and beyond. As the United Kingdom's new head of state, King Charles III inherits a country recovering from 2 years living under the spectre of a pandemic where its citizens face a precarious economic future with the cost of living spiraling. At a time of so much change, the calm, stoic and dignified leadership provided by his mother is something that many cherished, and despite his own personal grief, after 7 decades as heir to the throne, the moment has now arrived for the new king to fulfill his duty. And that was a juxtaposition of so many emotions really today. Every time you hear the national anthem, and of course one has to deal with the reality that God Save the Queen has been replaced by God Save the King. I'm sure I'm not alone in feeling another jolt of emotion every time at the transition, a reminder of what the nation has lost, but at the same time impossible really not to be moved by the most powerful people, past and present, gathering to witness this man who's waited his whole life to ascend to the throne, now stepping up and doing his duty. A time-honoured tradition, it is true. Not that we've ever witnessed it before, but just seeing him go through the motions was emotional, and quite apart from the fact that he once again chose to talk about his wife, his love for her, and making it very clear how much he valued that support. Now, we're still in St James's Palace here. Perhaps we should talk about this court, what it's witnessed and the traditions.
Well, it's interesting to see the soldiers. They're Coldstream Guards. Nulli secundus, that's their jibe at the Grenadiers, because the Coldstreamers were formed before the Grenadiers, but the Grenadiers were royal.
This is an argument that goes back to the period of the Civil War, we should say. You know.
It's a reflection of the Civil War in its own way.
But St James's Palace, I mean, lots of people will be familiar with Henry VIII, famous English monarch, and he built St James's Palace. So really the big events in history really played out there. From Henry VIII's reign onwards until the beginning of the 19th century, and the early part of the 19th century there was a fire in the private apartments of the monarch, and it was then we saw the gradual transition of the sort of living quarters of the monarch to Buckingham Palace where it is today. But these scenes, you know, have been repeated for centuries. I mean, it's quite remarkable. And we see, I mean, in a way what we've seen this morning is a glimpse under the bonnet of the UK Constitution. We've sort of seen how it all works and where it comes from, and it's the beginning of a process that will be played out now with the second stage, when the King will address Parliament and make his accession declaration. His personal declaration was this morning, where he will promise to retain his position, of course, as a Protestant, as it was alluded to here, and then the coronation oath, and the coronation is the third part of him becoming king.
Well, as you're saying, I mean, it's an extraordinary visual realisation, I suppose, of the web and weave and the complexity of it, and it's the way that our Constitution works, unwritten as it may be. Now, Paul, you've got Harriet Harman, former Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, of course, who was in the room and witnessed all of this.
Yeah, Tom, we're just having a chat actually about that political chemistry in the room earlier. But Harriet Harman is here with me. We are live on ITV. What was it like to be in that room?
Well, I think it was solemn. It was a very solemn and serious occasion because everybody was there and the new king was there because his mother had died and the Queen had died, but also the very serious business of proclaiming him to be the new king, and he made a short, very clear statement about mourning her loss, what an incredible example that she set, what a heavy responsibility it was on him, and that he would do his best. So it was a very solemn ceremonial moment.
And as the longest standing woman MP in Parliament, of course, you've seen plenty of occasions where the monarch has interacted with Parliament and been to state openings. Is there a difference to King Charles's presence in comparison to Queen Elizabeth? Does it feel like the start of a different reign, a new reign?
Well, obviously, it will be, to be seen how he does things differently. But I think the message very clearly today was the fundamentals of the Constitution. He will be supporting the role of the monarch, but also supporting his Parliament in what is a constitutional monarchy. So I think the underpinning is the same, but how he goes about that might well be different. But it was, as I say, a very solemn moment, very ceremonial, but very solemn.
So solemn, so ceremonial that actually 6 former Prime Ministers managed to stand in a room together, very dignified, very respectful. What was that like, to have such an incredible amount of political history all in one room together at once?
Well, I think it was just the most historic moment that any of us can imagine. Obviously, for a large part, the monarch's role is ceremonial, but it's at this sort of juncture that we realise what that ceremony actually means in practice. It means somebody who is there for the whole country. I mean, Jess Phillips, one of the MPs yesterday from Birmingham, said the Queen was all things to all people, but in a good way. Everybody could see her being there for them, and obviously that is what the new King will do as well.
And of course, such a figurehead of continuity, the Queen. And we're now entering these relatively uncertain economic and political times. We don't want to make a political point today, but do you have concerns about the nation moving forward now? We've got a change of Prime Minister and a change of monarch all in one week. This could potentially be quite an uncertain time, and the King's going to have to get to grips with that very quickly, isn't he?
Well, the Prime Minister, Liz Truss, said that the Queen was the rock on which this country, modern Britain, was built. And I think that is the role that the new King will play as well. He will be the foundation, he will be the underpinning of our democracy, whilst not actually engaging in politics.
All right, Harriet Harman, thanks so much for joining me this morning. What a fascinating morning you've had inside that Accession Council as the new King was proclaimed. And actually it was a really emotional moment out here too, Tom, because the crowds, of course, got to watch the proclamation on the balcony here. There were cheers for the new King. The first time very publicly we've heard that proclamation of God Save the King. A really emotional moment, and one that the hundreds of people here, I'm sure, will never forget.
Paul, thank you very much. And a reminder, we are sometimes cynical about politicians. It is fair to say, and perhaps for understandable reasons, but seeing all those prime ministers there, it is a reminder of the unique pressures they're under, running the country, taking lots of decisions, dealing with massive crises like the cost of living, decisions of war and peace. And as we've talked about in the last 24 hours, who can they really talk honestly about those decisions, their complexities with their family, of course, but perhaps above all the monarch. And we had the new Prime Minister and the new monarch having the first of those conversations just yesterday. And it is intriguing, therefore, seeing all of them in the same room. Chris, maybe I can just put that to you. I mean, I did find that was what I was thinking as I was looking at all that, is just the complexity of that relationship in our constitutional monarchy between the monarch and the leading politicians of the day.
Yes, you know what? I think we've heard over the last, 24 hours or so from the tributes in the House of Commons, but also to interviews like of which Harriet Harman gave, was that sort of relationship doesn't just exist between the Queen and her Prime Minister, it exists between the Queen and lots of members of Parliament, as Harriet Harman told the Commons yesterday when she got sacked by Tony Blair. The only person who called her phone was the Queen and invited her over for tea to come and have a chat about her time in office. And these are the kind of things that we're really only finding out about now. They've always been, all of these MPs have kept their counsel until this point. And I just think they feel like this is the moment moment to share those memories. So it's a very unique relationship. But I think, as Anna was saying earlier, we're getting a look under the bonnet of the British Constitution here, aren't we? This very ancient ceremony. I probably wasn't the only one, Tom, I'm sure you were too, who felt like I just stepped back a couple of centuries, seeing a Garter King of Arms standing on a balcony of an ancient palace, and the soldiers, the captain of the King's Guard, ordering the soldiers in front of him to then slope and then ground their arms and remove their headdress to do 3 cheers to the King. If you're watching this in the UK, you probably think it's quite something. If you're watching it from other parts of the world, I think it really is quite a spectacle, and we are witnessing a moment in history unfolding in front of us right now.
Chris, one other intriguing thing, I mean, of course, the new King Charles did not have the benefit of ever having seen this. Most of us alive haven't witnessed this occasion. We've certainly never been allowed cameras in. Prince William, the new Prince of Wales, of course, was right there, sort of watching this, and you know, I mean, who knows what he was thinking? But as his father said, you know, or alluded to, you know, he's not a young man. He, you know, even with the best will in the world, he won't rule forever, and it isn't going to be very long before the new Prince of Wales, Prince William, is sitting at that desk.
Well, of course, you know, we were discussing earlier in the programme, weren't we, about the fact that we've now had a pledge from the new king to serve for the rest of his life. Therefore, just as his mother did, that there will never be an abdication and the crown will not pass to Prince William until the demise of the current king. It feels rather odd, Tom, to be talking about that on a day like this. I'm just keeping my eye out that way at the moment because I'm hearing a cheer from the crowds. It's in fact, there are more crowds here, Tom, than I've seen at any point. It could be that it's now a weekend and it's a Saturday, but the crowds are now going all the way up the Mall. They've sort of surrounded the Queen Victoria Memorial in front of me. So let me just keep an eye out behind me just to see what's going to happen. But yeah, I agree with you that there we have the current or the new Prince of Wales witnessing with his own eyes what happens in the Accession Council, and that wasn't something that was afforded to Prince Charles. In fact, famously, we saw Prince Charles as a 4-year-old boy in the window of Buckingham Palace, seeing his mother leave for the coronation as well. So these are very different times. We have a monarch taking over at a very different age. And, you know, it's just a reminder, isn't it, again and again, about we are entering from one reign into another, and a very different reign it is.
Chris, thank you very much. Well, we heard Paul talking to a leading politician or former leading politician in the room, but he now has a leading man of faith, perhaps with a different perspective. Paul, back to you.
Yeah, Tom, I'm here with the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, who was also in that Accession Council, as you say, not just politicians, but figureheads from the church too. Good morning to you, Rowan Williams. Thank you so much for joining me. What was it like for you in that room? Because this was such a historic occasion, and we actually got to see it ourselves because it was televised, but you were in there witnessing it with your own eyes.
Very intense feeling, really. A sense of continuity, I suppose, to say the obvious. Something that's been going on for centuries, and a feeling that, yes, there are some things about our Constitution which do survive. Also, I think, a sense which has always been important in British politics, that the monarchy is something which exists with the consent of the people. It's not simply an absolutist system. It's something which this morning is represented as something which we own together.
I thought that was interesting as well, the interaction that we saw, you know, Penny Mordaunt reading the order of events, and then the King having to agree to what she said, which was an exact reminder of what you've just said. You know Charles, King Charles. How do you think he will go about his reign, and what will be different, do you think, about his reign as opposed to Queen Elizabeth's reign?
Impossible to predict in detail at the moment, but I think he's somebody who, as he said this morning in the ceremony, will have seen how it's done. You know, he's had the best possible example of how to conduct this unique and really challenging job. He's a man of intelligence, emotional intelligence, who I think will pick up how to relate to the complexities of the political world. I suspect there'll be some concern to streamline, to modernise some aspects of the workings of monarchy and the royal family, which has been around for quite a while. And I think also that Her late Majesty was somebody who while recognising that had to happen, knew that possibly she wasn't the person to carry it through, and it was something which would belong very naturally in a new reign. I would guess that they've had conversations in recent months as the Queen has slowly and gracefully handed over to the next generation.
And as you say, it seems as though King Charles has a slightly different style, a more emotional style, a man who speaks perhaps a little bit more from the heart. Would you say that's fair?
I think on the evidence of what we've heard yesterday, today, he is prepared to, not to wear his heart on his sleeve, but certainly to talk about his feelings very, very openly and candidly. And that will fit with some aspects of the society we're now in. And as I say, he's a person of emotional intelligence. He'll bring that to bear on what he does.
The crowd are just filing out here because, of course, this part of the ceremony is over. There'll be further events in the coming days. And King Charles isn't just the monarch, he's also the head of the Church of England. So that will be an interesting dynamic for the Church now too, won't it?
Yes, and strictly speaking, of course, supreme governor of the Church rather than head, because it means he's the final court of appeal and things.
Yes.
But it does matter to have somebody in that position whose own religious commitment is very serious, who's explored, for example, the spirituality of Eastern Orthodoxy very extensively, and who thinks and I think prays about this. So I suspect that in terms of his relation with the Church, he will be engaged. He won't just be a figurehead.
Former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Thank you.
OK, Tom, so as you can see, proceedings really wrapping up here now at St James's Palace. It was quick, but was it momentous.
OK, Paul, thank you very much indeed. And this is maybe a moment to ask my guests here to just reflect on that. We've all been sort of discussing how intriguing it was in all kinds of ways to see it. But as we were discussing just now, in a precinct that has seen so many of our key episodes in history, what were your own reflections on seeing it?
Well, it is a remarkable historic continuity, and the monarchy is important as continuity. It represents continuity in our society. One of the things I noticed in the proclamation was an absence of some language. It used to rehearse who was there, and including at the end used to be the words "gentlemen of quality," and that's disappeared. And I think that, plus the way in which people were dressed much more informally than hitherto, things like the way the Queen has spoken, her manner of speech has changed over the years. And these are sort of reflections of the changes in our society. We become, perhaps, a more equal society, or we think of ourselves as a more equal society. That's a very, very important change.
Yeah, I mean, it is a bit tingling for me. I mean, I'm writing a book on the transition from the end of the first Elizabethan reign in 1603 to into the reign of James I. And
because I'm assuming that is the very court that Elizabeth I was proclaimed. I mean, that's the thing that's hard to get your head around. For centuries, people have been lucky enough to come and witness that is exactly what they've witnessed, right?
Yeah, and now people riding out to the Royal Exchange and around the country. I mean, I've been reading about accounts of this in 1603, and of course it's true years before. I mean, it is remarkable. And I mean, you go to the National Archives in Kew and you read proclamations, and they're these long documents, as Bob referred to, lots and lots of names previously, and wound up parchment with a seal on. And they referred in the council, in the Privy Council, to the continuation of the use of the old seals, and people might have been wondering what that's about. Well, they are the wax seals which make parliamentary statutes into law. Every Secretary of State is given a seal of office, and the seal has on the front, the current one, the late Queen enthroned, and on the back, her on horseback. And so what we'll see over the next few months and years, a transition with a new seal cast of the new king. And also it will begin to signal over time, and it won't be immediate, of course, the Royal Mint producing new coins and notes with Charles's image on it. Stamps will change in due course. At some point when we walk past our post boxes, it won't say ER anymore, it will say CR. I mean, this is such how the monarchy is woven into the fabric of our society, and for some people it will all just seem bonkers, and for some people really momentous.
Well, you made the point that you don't get many more dramatic illustrations of the clash between, you know, ancient traditions and modernity. There was this proclamation, as you say, not very different, if different at all, from Elizabeth I, and yet they're filming it on mobile phones. I mean,
there's a brilliant image there of the heralds proclaiming the news in the, you know, the most ancient form, and then people snapping it on their mobile phones. And that is exactly the point of where we are with society and the monarchy now.
Penny, I just wonder what, you know, you have spoken to King Charles many times, you've written books about it. What did you make of just watching this morning?
Well, I mean, I feel incredibly sort of excited and privileged to be living at this moment, to be watching this, and to be witnessing the transition. You know, for years I've written about the stability of monarchy and how it's the one stable thing in our society when the rest of the world is changing so rapidly. But you know, that is what gives us a sort of anchor to keeps ourselves grounded, and it's important. And what we're seeing actually is exactly that. You know, the Queen has been with us for my entire life and everybody's entire life here. And she's as familiar as you know, post boxes. But I must say I was concerned that there would be a real hiatus when she died. But I don't think there's going to be. I think we're going to have...
Can I just ask you one other thing, though? Because the thing that I was really struck by just watching, I guess, the juxtaposition of monarch and so many politicians it's just a reminder that, of course, life's not going to be I mean, it's never for a Prime Minister. Decisions come thick and fast. But it isn't for a monarch either. You think of the times the Queen has had to sort of step up, capture the mood of the nation, give an address in the middle of the pandemic. We've talked a lot about that. So for the new king, I mean, things are going to come quite thick and fast, and he's going to have to make judgments, and we're going to form a view of him quite quickly.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. But I mean, I think we're already beginning to form a view. You know, I mean, I've had a view of him for years because I've been writing about him for years. But you know, talk to the average person in the street. They don't know what he has done with these decades of waiting. You know, he's been such a visionary. All the issues that he has taken to heart, that he was mocked for, are now absolutely mainstream. The people, you know, his charities that he's set up, the young people that he's helped, all of this, you know, you and I know about it, but there are a lot of people who don't. And I think that I hope that at last we will see the king for the extraordinary man that he is.
OK, there's so much more to unpick there, but Anna was mentioning that obviously one of the things now, we've seen the proclamation, much as it was in Elizabeth I's time, on that balcony, but one of the things that was an issue, as Anna was referencing, centuries ago, before any kind of mass communication, was how did he let the country know? Well, people spread out to spread the word, and Rebecca Barry is outside the Royal Exchange, where the second proclamation will be made. Rebecca, a lot of people have made the journey into central London, I guess, for a chance to witness this, as we just saw in St James's.
Yeah, and the crowds here seem full of curiosity. This is a wholly unfamiliar moment. Most people won't have even heard of a proclamation before. We've already seen the arrival of the pikemen and musketeers, dressed in their 17th century uniforms with steel armour, carrying swords and 12-foot pikes. We are watching a modern-day reenactment of traditions that have lain dormant for 7 decades. And I can speak to one family who've travelled all the way down from Doncaster to be here today. Jenny, hello. Can you tell me why it was so important for you to be here today?
It's just such a momentous occasion. My nan remembers the Queen becoming the Queen. So I think my children will remember that they came to see when the King became the King. It's such a massive thing in history, and in their lives it's going to just mean so much.
Yeah, you've got 6-year-old Teddy and 6-month-old Archie here. Strange to think that they will grow up not knowing, really, not remembering the reign of Queen Elizabeth II.
The Queen, that's the only one we've ever known, and they're not going to remember it. It's a real shame.
You seem emotional.
I just loved her. Just thought she did so much for everybody and didn't sometimes get the praise that she deserved.
Thank you for sharing that. And Steve, I wanted to ask the significance of today for you.
Yeah, well, I served in the army for 7 years, and coming to occasions like this has always been a big part of my life.
Did you ever meet the Queen?
Yeah, several occasions on guard at Windsor Castle mainly, and she came to our barracks as well.
Do you have any memories of her? What are your feelings towards the Queen?
I think every memory of her was quite special. It was meeting the Queen was such a massive occasion for me and my family.
We can hear the noise of the procession behind us. This is all about the transition, of course, from Queen to King. So how do you feel about our new King?
Obviously a big fan. I really appreciate everything he does, and impressed by the way he's handling all the situation.
Okay, we better go because I think we're going to get drowned out by the procession here. Take a look, it's pretty impressive.
Okay, well, Rebecca there was talking about what we're now going to witness. So we have had the proclamation at St James's Palace, as Anna has been referencing this morning, time-honoured, right back to Elizabeth I, century after century, we've seen the same thing. But the issue in centuries past was how to let the rest of the country know. So that is what we're going to be witnessing for the rest of this morning. Chris, I mean, this is, we've talked a little bit about what we've already witnessed, but let's just talk a little bit more about how the rest of the morning and the day is likely to pan out.
Yes, well, actually, we haven't seen the new king, have we, Tom, since the Accession Council, part 2 of the Accession Council there. But he's got a series of appointments waiting for him. He's holding several audiences at Buckingham Palace this afternoon. So I think that's probably what the crowds here at Buckingham Palace are waiting for. I mean, you're watching pictures at the moment right in the heart of the city of London, where there are crowds there waiting for that the next proclamation of the new king. The crowds here are just, I suppose they're waiting for something, Tom, and I think there is an expectation that at some point they're going to see the new king come past. If you know your geography of the various palaces around here, we've been explaining this morning how St James's Palace is the most senior of them all. But St James's Palace in Clarence House, where the King and Queen Consort, we believe, stayed overnight, has been their home, their London home, for many, many years now, and it's quite easy to sort of walk between the two of them. In fact, I think they're actually physically joined by bricks and mortar at one point. So Clarence House and St James's House are one and the same thing. So at some point, therefore, the new king and Queen Consort, we all have to remember how to say those words, don't we, Tom? Will be travelling from Clarence House and travelling to Buckingham Palace. A short drive, but that's what the crowds are waiting for, and he will hold those meetings with the Prime Minister, with the Cabinet, with leaders of the opposition, with the Archbishop of Canterbury. Busy old afternoon inside Buckingham Palace.
Okay, Chris, thank you very much indeed. Well, I'm joined in the studio now by broadcaster and speechwriter for Prince Charles on occasion, and author Ian Skelly, and Dame Julia Cleverton, who's also a friend of our new king. Still getting used to saying that, aren't we? Well, perhaps you're not, but it's quite something. Prince of Wales, now king, and just fascinating to see him beginning to get into his paces. Having known him so long, I guess none of this surprises you, but I'd love to just begin with a sort of personal reflection on seeing this man you've known so long stepping up. Julia, maybe you first. What did you make of what you've seen this morning?
Well, I think the new king showed all the things that those of us who've worked with him, I ran business in the community and then worked with him on his charities until 2014, so I suppose I've seen him for 30 years and probably for about the same sort of time. I think one has always known that he would be a great king, and that his experience, probably the best prepared king there could ever have been. He has tacked the whole of this country and much of the Commonwealth for all his life.
I don't think this will have surprised you, but I did think it was notable. I think most people have thought it was notable. I mean, he's referenced with great love and affection his wife, twice now. His first two speeches, he's referenced her in both. I mean, it's hard not to be affected by that because his emotion is pretty clear. But it's also a clear indication this is going to be a joint partnership. I mean, no surprise to you, I'm sure.
No, I mean, the Duchess of Cornwall, as she was the patron of the National Literacy Trust, which I've been chairing. So I've worked very closely with her for the last 8 years. And I think one is absolutely clear that this is a very strong partnership, and they have been together, married for 17 years. So I think the joint enterprise and the joint connections about what to do and how to do it and what life has been like has been an immensely strong rock for them both.
Ian, can I just ask you about the speech? Because it's the second time, and we've been discussing this, and actually Bob was making the point just a short time ago that he thought actually it was a clear, just a reminder that there is no possibility of abdication for all the reasons you might kind of well imagine. But, this reference to what time God grants me left, he didn't specifically have to say that. Did you read anything into that as a sort of indication of, I felt it was almost like an act of humility. I'm not 25, but what I've got left, I'm going to grant to your service. How did you interpret it?
Well, I think just that. I mean, there's no question of abdication at all. Let's rule that out to start with. And he's taking on the role that his mother took on and making the same promise that she made. I think both today and also the speech that he gave last night was also laced with a profound amount of emotion. You've already just used the word love. He used the word love a couple of times in that speech yesterday, and indeed even in the one this morning, which indicates to me, and both Julia and I know this, that he's a very sensitive, very affectionate person, somebody who cares deeply, deeply from the heart, about people. And that comes across, and has always come across to me whenever I watched him working these enormous rooms where there are 200 or 300 people at a time, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day, giving people his full attention and giving as much of his attention to the last person he meets as the first person he meets, which is, of course, partly to do with this endless amount of training that he's gone through and preparation, but also that it comes from the heart. And I think that's what I've been most struck by in both of these big public statements, that they've not been just formal. We've got a real sense of a real human being behind them who intends from the very start to have that kind of heart on the sleeve approach.
I think that's very true, and that's very intriguing. But can I just ask you about abdication for one thing? To be clear, is that about, as we were talking with Bob, no one in the monarchy who knows anything about the monarchy wants to interfere with the natural common law process because it has a simplicity? Is it about because for Prince, now King Charles, duty is like literally all he's thought about all his life, and the idea of giving that up until you're gone is, unconscionable, and that seemed to be the Queen's approach. I mean, is it the latter, the simplicity of the latter that is really, and that's why you just rule it out straight away?
Yeah, I mean, it's been bred into him that this is what you do, and the whole system depends upon this. I mean, you have to go back, apart from the abdication, a very long way before we had any kind of regency, for example, and that was a very extreme situation. The sovereign rules until death comes, and there's no question in his mind that that's exactly what's going to happen in his case, and for that matter, in his son's case.
Now, we just, as you will have witnessed, we have moved from St James's Palace. The focus is moving elsewhere. We're going down to the Royal Exchange here. Bob, we were very clear, the Accession Council, the proclamation, what that was all about, time-honoured. You very clearly, thankfully, filled us in on the kind of historical origins going back to the pre-Norman conquest times and the Anglo-Saxons and how it's evolved over the centuries since. But what is the rest of the morning about? Could you just explain to us what we're witnessing now, what we're going to witness, and crucially, why?
Well, it's a reaching out. I mean, it looks like mere repetition, but it's a reaching out to the population more widely, which will continue, of course, tomorrow in the provincial capitals. And, of course, these are scenes in the city, and, of course, the city was represented in the council, the Accession Council itself. The Lord Mayor was present with some of his alderman colleagues, and this repeats and, as it were, I suppose you can say, increases the volume of the arrangements that are signified by these formal ceremonies. They look, you could say they look a bit antique, you know, these gentlemen dressed as pikemen. Back we are to the Civil War. It was never far away.
Yes, the Civil War. We like it or not, we drift in and out of the Civil War. Whether it's the Coldstreams versus the Grenadiers or the pikemen.
Yes.
So talk us through why we're at the Civil War at this point.
Well, these, of course, are the ancient civil levies dressed up in the original form of dress for the middle of the 17th century. And they're all volunteers these days, of course, and city gents who've got other jobs as well.
The city, presumably, I mean, the importance of the city to the monarchy is the obvious one, finance back in the day, you know, because obviously raising money was a long preoccupation of the monarchy over the centuries, which generally got it into trouble. After all, Charles I hadn't needed money, probably we would never have had that particular revolution.
But it was also, of course, the original stronghold.
Yeah.
And until, you know, a couple of hundred years ago, the monarch always overnighted in the Tower of London and then made a procession to Westminster. And that ceremony has gone now, of course. But it was a great celebration for the city, who provided all sorts of masks and entertainments on the way. And indeed, we learned that the royal companies of actors lent clothes to the city men to conduct their ceremonies as they went along.
Is the logic of the city remaining a part of this simply to respect an ancient tradition? I mean, you know, the proclamation. We sort of talked about the historical origins of the Accession Council, and I'm sure lots of people thinking and watching, well, this is very arcane. But sort of weirdly, watching it this morning, you kind of think it does have sort of some modern relevance if you look at the complexity of our constitution, because you're witnessing all these senior politicians in a room making it clear that they accept this principle, the constitutional principle, and acclaim the king.
Yes, and equally, the king, of course, is endorsing parliamentary government. I mean, there's a process of mutual legitimization, you might say. And that's where we've got to in our constitution. We got there some hundreds of years ago on a rather narrower franchise, but in the 18th century, Europeans regarded us as an aristocratic republic. And you hear some of the revolutionaries in America regarding us as a republic too, because we had the rule of law, rather than the rule of the prince.
Julia, you're sort of, are you about to reflect on that?
I mean, absolutely fascinating, but I'm just thinking that the Prince of Wales, as a historian, and as Ian and I know, somebody who cares passionately about traditions and history, and why were those pikemen wearing that hat, and what in the First Nation in Canada, what can we learn from what they did? He must have, without thinking too firmly about how he must have been feeling this morning, he must have seen all those Privy Councillors, most of whom were the politicians of the last 50 years, all those ex-prime ministers standing together in a gaggle having a gossip. He must have seen the whole of his political relationships and connections in front of him, acclaiming, rightly, that he is the king.
But that's such a sobering moment, isn't it? When you kind of think that, you know, all these people who've had this immense executive power over war and peace, who've been elected by the people, all of them standing there and acclaiming you. I mean, I don't care how long you've prepared for that. That's quite an adjustment, isn't it? I mean,
well, it would have been a very emotional time.
Yes.
He's you know, he will feel the significance of this and the change in the role so clearly.
I mean, I'm sure I have read this. I've never heard him described as a historian before, but I suppose that's obvious, really. You would. I mean, his grasp of history, I mean, I just assumed was very good, but I've never heard it sort of articulated quite that clearly.
No, I mean, he would. I think I'm right in saying he would describe himself as a historian more than anything else. He loves literature as well. It's interesting that he quotes Shakespeare in his first speech as king. I wasn't surprised about that at all. You can read an awful lot into that quotation as well, because
this is sorry, I'm going to misquote it, but let angels take you, thee at thy rest.
Yes, which comes from
I just did mangle, I'm afraid to say, but
which comes from Hamlet, but also very interestingly, and this will not have gone without notice. It's also a line used in a piece of music by John Tavener, Song of Athene, which was sung as Princess Diana's coffin was walked out of Westminster Abbey. That would have been understood when he chose that quotation. So I found that rather moving that she was there too.
It was a well-written speech, I thought, yesterday. I mean, I think pretty much everyone's accepted that this morning, and I thought it was so interesting as a speech, because on the one hand he said some quite important stuff. We've talked about the reference to his beloved wife. We've talked about referencing his son, who is now the Prince of Wales, and the new Princess of Wales, making sure that he included Harry and Meghan. But then, either side, what was the phrase he used? A promise with destiny kept, when he talked about his mother, and then, as you say, quoting Hamlet at the end. I mean, I felt like it was a well-constructed, well thought out, with enough kind of balance between rhetoric that you will remember and will stand the test of time, but some quite practical messages in there too, right?
Yes, and also this one line which stuck in my mind, which was bringing the marginal into the centre so that they can benefit from the help. That sums up all his work with the Prince's Trust and all the organisations you were involved with.
And I thought I agree entirely, it was a great speech. I'm sure he penned every word of it. He may have had a part to play, but it was him throughout. And I thought it was so clear that he saw the role change. Not only was he announcing then that the Prince of Wales role would be taken on, but he also announced that he would be stepping back from the causes and the charities that had taken so much of his energy and passion in his previous time, and that they would be well led and were going to be fine. And that is a very important change in all the conversations about, well, will this man be the king, or will he be continue to go on, as some would say, meddling? Many of us would say mobilising.
Well, that's going to be very intriguing. As we were just talking about that with Penny, this idea that events are going to come quite thick and fast. You think of the way the Queen stepped up and sort of tried to capture the mood very successfully. I think captured the mood of the nation. It was that reassuring message in the middle of the pandemic. Look, life will return to normal. We will meet again, and all the rest of it was actually a very powerful. And these moments are probably going, particularly given the climate we're in, economic and political, these moments may come thick and fast for him, and maybe we can talk about that in a moment. But let's go down to these scenes as we wait at the Royal Exchange. Rebecca, I mean, this is colour personified in terms of, I mean, Bob was just talking about the Civil War origins, which we've referred to quite a lot today, but this is again, a moment of great pomp and ceremony.
Yeah, and everyone who's here is a first-hand witness to a spectacle that hasn't been seen for 70 years. When we just watched the pikemen and musketeers marching past here, I felt like I'd stepped back in time. They were dressed in their uniforms from the 16th century, their drums sounding, calling the attention of the nation. Next, we expect to see a procession of officials, including the Lord Mayor, who'll make their way here from Mansion House up towards the Royal Exchange for the second proclamation. Over the last couple of days, I've spoken to so many people who've expressed their deep sadness at the death of the Queen, but this is all about the transition from the Queen to our new King. And although people here are experiencing a brilliant display of British pageantry, this is about acknowledging that transition.
Okay, Rebecca, thank you very much indeed. Well, Bob, perhaps I can bring you back in here as we wait. We've talked a little bit about the history, the importance of the city, not just economically, but as a power stronghold, which, is part of the origin of this. But what it would be, perhaps you could tell us a little more about exactly what we're witnessing here and what we're about to witness, and what its remaining relevance is.
Yes, well, I think what it does nowadays is it's a recognition of the importance of commerce in our public life. And the city stands as an example of that, handily down the road from where you were grown and so on. And of course, it stands for also, of course, the sources of taxation and money and so on and so forth, and our history for that, and the unfortunate kinds of events that occurred when the English crown managed to bankrupt its Italian financiers. And eventually, of course, we got the Dutch influence, which is very important. It was the origin of the Bank of England in many ways, and it taught British government how to fight wars with other people's money, which was an advance and the base of much of the imperial adventure.
Well, it's maybe worth saying that one of the, historically, it's always seemed to me, the moments when the British monarchy really got into trouble was when it was fighting wars, because wars are very expensive, and people of influence and money in the country wanted a say in it, and that's ultimately, where we ended up. But money was an endless preoccupation. I mean, it was hard to imagine now when everything is moved to such different areas, but money was the singular preoccupation of monarchy for many centuries.
Yes,
right.
And it was, of course, crucial that in the civil wars, the city supported Parliament. And that meant that Parliament was bound to win, actually. Although, and the criticism of Charles, of course, was that he started the Second Civil War, and it was for that he was executed.
Well, I was going to say, when you, every time, well, we could spend a long time talking about Charles I and his stubbornness, but that's perhaps a subject for a different time. But here we go. Let's have a listen. We're just discussing what we're witnessing in the studio here. We think that's the City Marshal in the front. I'm going to ask Bob to talk us through the origin of the uniforms, even if we call them a uniform. I don't know. What do you...
Oh, well, they are uniforms, effectively. I notice they're not walking in step, so they're not soldiers, that's for sure. And the College of Arms, from which the heralds come, is situated on the edge of the city, and its charter dates from the time of Richard III. So that's how long they've had this official residence. They also have medieval salaries, which of course are now laughable in terms of...
Haven't moved since 1840, was it? Or long before?
Probably, or perhaps in some time before that, I think.
Which, I mean, presumably, sort of 40, 50 pounds. Or that's
yes, a serious sum of money.
Once upon a time, yes, that was a serious sum of money. It just hasn't moved.
But they're funded nowadays mostly not only from gifts of well-wishers and so on, but from their professional activities, because they draw up people's arms, coats of arms. They keep pedigrees and update the pedigrees. If you go into the college, you'll see vast arrays of cupboards. I wondered what there was in there, and I thought, well, it's the pedigrees of people who keep their pedigrees here. You know. And reverting to the point I was making earlier about the absence in the proclamation of gentlemen equality. Gentlemen equality, no doubt, were expected to have pedigrees kept in the College of Arms. No, who knows? I'm not sure about that.
It's probably not going to be the headline of the day, is
No.
it? The absence of gentlemen of equality. It's. I mean, it's fascinating and niche, but sort of interesting. And actually, I mean, you know, how do you update? I mean, how do you make? I mean, maybe you just don't bother. But it's impossible to update this really, because the whole purpose of it is its tradition.
It's to signify continuity. Yeah. This is the society making a change of its head of state and head of nation, but it's still the same society. And it goes back and back and back. You know?
There's that great remark by the Bishop of London, Richard Charters, who said, we feel sorry for people who've lost their memories. Yes. And I think the Prince of Wales, as he was, now the King, would be very clear about the importance of the roots of all of this.
Do you know, I went to the bicentennial celebration of the Revolution in Paris, in whatever year that was, many years ago now. And the thing that it was a sort of amazing few days, and it really struck me as such. The thing that it totally lacked was a focus, it seemed to me. And just the way in which, you know, I remember trying to explain the royal family and their position in national life to people who aren't British. And it's complex and it takes a while, but it's that sort of business in which your view of your country is just tied up with this individual who is the monarch.
So it's one of the reasons why the French are fascinated by the monarchy. I mean, they had the misfortune to lose their monarchy. They tried to re-establish it,
yes.
And it's not been very successful. And the head of state is just another politician, and he's there only for a term. Yeah.
And I think it's interesting that we refer to the monarch as the head of state, but as the sovereign. Actually, the principle of the sovereign is at the centre. I've always been fascinated by the Garter ceremony and watching that procession, you know, when they wear their plumed hats and they process down through to the chapel at St George's. And I expected
the Knights of the Garter being in the monarch's gift,
yes,
obviously.
I expected the monarch to lead the procession. When I saw it was the Queen. Actually, she was at the centre of the procession, not at the head of it. And I think if you recognise that that's what we're talking about, the principle of sovereignty is the still point of the turning circle, as T.S. Eliot would have put it, I suppose. You know, I think that's possibly a better way almost of explaining it.
We're listening, if you're wondering what we're watching here, The Silence in the City, we are waiting for the second proclamation, which will be essentially a repeat of the first, but as we've been discussing, this is a kind of historically incredibly important moment. The country doesn't know it's got a new monarch. Not everyone clearly can make the journey to the Palace of St James's, so once the proclamation's been made there, the proclamation needs to be made elsewhere so that people all over the country. So if you're thinking back over the centuries, you know, this was a crucial moment. This is when you learned that you had a new monarch, and that was proclaimed, and we're just building up to the fanfare. What we've already witnessed, I think, has surprised a lot of us, even though we've been steeped in this and expecting it for a long time. But just the emotion of witnessing the new king, listening to his speech, the remarkable nature of seeing all those politicians, past and present, prime ministers chatting with each other. Obviously, we were all desperate to know what they were talking about. Clearly been able to find that out and are never likely to. But this is quite a moment. But we expect the fanfare here to begin just in any moment. So let's just pause and have a listen.
Whereas it has pleased Almighty God to call to his mercy our late Sovereign Lady, Queen Elizabeth II, of blessed and glorious memory, by whose decease the crown of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland is solely and rightfully come to the Prince Charles Philip Arthur George. We therefore, the Lord Spiritual and Temporal of this realm, and members of the House of Commons, together with other members of Her late Majesty's Privy Council, and representatives of the realms and territories, aldermen and citizens of London, and others, do now hereby, with one voice and consent of tongue and heart, publish and proclaim that the Prince Charles Philip Arthur George is now, by the death of our late sovereign of happy memory, become our only lawful and rightful liege lord, Charles III, by the grace of God of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and of his other realms and territories, King, Head of the Commonwealth, Defender of the Faith, to whom we do acknowledge all faith and obedience with humble affection, beseeching God, by whom kings and queens do reign, to bless his majesty with long and happy years to reign over us. Given at St. James's Palace this 10th day of September in the year of our Lord, 2022. God save the King. God save the King.
Three cheers for His Majesty the King. Hip hip, hooray! Hip hip, hooray! Hip hip, hooray!
Well, once again, the proclamation, as we saw it at St James's, repeated in the city. If you're just tuning in and wondering what on earth you're witnessing, which you may well be, because these are scenes we don't see very often, but it has been, I have to say, a fascinating morning. I thought it was going to be fascinating, but it's been absolutely intriguing on every level. To see the new king, quite emotional, to see him speaking in quite emotional terms, referencing his wife again. There was and his love for her. There was a emotional, and I think most people feel well-judged speech yesterday. Another today, stepping up as king. A reminder really for all of us that though he has lost his mother, and we may have lost a sovereign that many, if not pretty much everyone in the country, had huge affection, if not outright love for, events move on. We have a new king. Business is crowding in on him in all kinds of ways. Some of it procedural, some of it constitutional, some of it in the days ahead actually political, because the decisions will come thick and fast. I mean, Bob, we're just watching the winding up here. You know, this is a ceremony we've talked about, its origins going right back to the Civil War and so forth. But perhaps for anyone just tuning in for the first time, let's just recap one more time what the significance of this is.
Yes, this is the occasion where the proclamation, which has been first declared at the Friary Court in St James's Palace, the party moves, led by the Garter King of Arms, to the city, and this is the occasion outside the Royal Exchange, where, as it were, the palace meets the city. And it's an occasion where, amongst other things, it represents the king's, the monarchy's acknowledgement of the importance of commerce in British life and the relationship between the crown and its citizens. Of course, nowadays this ceremony will be repeated in slightly different form in the provincial capitals, where it wasn't formally done. But they are ceremonies of the same character, if with different kinds of level of ceremony, representing the way in which the population at large is admitted to the system whereby they acknowledge the accession of the new king and give their support.
Well, if you, I mean, this, we've talked about this, but you know, if you're watching this, I think it is important to just imagine a world. We've seen the clash between ancient tradition and modernity already, the proclamation at St James's, and then people filming it on their mobile phones are just a reminder of how much has changed. But you know, really to understand this, you have to kind of put yourself back, if you can, this morning as you sip your coffee, 100 years or 200 years or 300 years when there was no way of communicating except by an individual on horseback. So the proclamation of a new king or queen in this manner was a very big deal, and it was how you learned of who your new monarch was. Now, we've spoken a lot, we've covered a lot of ground this morning. We've gone from the Anglo-Saxons to the Normans to the Civil War to the Restoration, and Bob has I think we've covered almost all ground, common law. We haven't quite got round to why the Restoration didn't worked here but didn't in France, but we'll leave that for another day. Let's talk about the new king and the future, and I'm joined, Julia is still with us, I'm joined by Joan Armatrading. Yes, that is the Joan Armatrading, possibly one of the greatest musicians, if not the greatest musician of all time. I'd really love to talk about that because I'm one of your biggest fans, but I will leave that to the side for this morning because she is also a trustee of the Prince's Trust. Can we talk about the new king? You know, the big moment for him. You've worked very closely with him. What have been your impressions over the years, and how have you felt about the last 24 hours watching him step up to this enormous new role?
Well, he will definitely step up, but I would say there's not a huge amount of stepping up because he's a grown-up and he knows what he needs to do. He knew the boundaries as a prince, and he certainly knows the confines of being the king. But he's a man of duty. He's a man of service. He knows how to communicate with people. That's his strength. I've seen him with the young people that the Prince's Trust has helped, and he's very engaged. He's not talking to I don't feel, he's not talking to them as then a prince. to his subjects. He's talking to them as a person to another person. And all he wants to do is help. And if you go back to 1976 when the Trust was founded, I mean, I remember watching the Prince on, the then Prince on the television and seeing how he communicated with underprivileged kids and black and Asian kids and white kids who needed help as well. I mean, he was just engaging with them, talking with them on the same level, if you like. And he was younger then, so it was working. And all he wanted to do was help. That's all I've known for all this time. And I don't see that he would be any different as king. I see he would still want to engage with people. He'd still want to show that he's a person of compassion and thought.
I mean, there is a big question which I'd maybe ask you to address about how his charitable work goes on. Now he's got this enormous new workload because he has built up this. I think, you know, we've heard so much about his charitable work, but what do you think you mentioned just helping, but what have you found his drivers to be in life through the prism of your experience of him?
I think his drivers is just that he's a people person. And when you like people and when you want to help people, I don't know, he needs much more than that. He spent his life trying to, you know, get as many people around him that can help him to help people. And that's one of the reasons I'm there, to try and do whatever I can to make his charity work. But he definitely is a person, certainly when it was the Prince's Trust now, he definitely was the person who wanted everybody to, the focus was the young people. That was the focus. The focus was, what do these young people need to help them to, for education, for business, for just social help, for mental health, for safeguarding, whatever it is, what can we do to make that work the best it possibly can for the young people?
Julia, you're wanting to add something here.
Well, I think the Prince's Trust has been one of the most important drivers for him. What can he do to support young people who haven't had the best necessary chance in life or got on the wrong side of the tracks? How can he help and support? But he has been extraordinary in his understanding over the years of all the different parts of society that need to work together. I ran business community for a long time. He really understood about the importance of inspiring business to get involved in the most deprived communities to tackle the key issues. And for him, of course, the key issue over the years has been climate change and environment. But he's understood, as he sets off now, taking the proclamation across the whole of the country, there will not be a place where he puts his foot, where he has not been involved, and his wife too, in charitable purposes, supporting community entrepreneurs, walking housing estates, understanding what's going on in Blackpool, Burnley, Burslem, Birkenhead. He has seen it all and understands the historical purposes, the roots of it all, but has helped to give the wings that have got people to believe that they can make a difference in this place.
Joan, can I just ask you, just to describe, you know, not everyone watching this programme will know about the work of the Prince's Trust, so just give us a sense of what a difference it does make.
Oh, it makes a massive difference. I remember when I started with the Trust first, and I started with the Trust as an ambassador, 1982, you got £50 grant to, you know, buy a sewing machine or something. And now the Trust has grown into something that's much more, much bigger, in that it will give people loans that they would never be able to get that kind of a loan from a bank or within society, where, you know, when they're doing their repayments. And it's helping, as Julia said, to helping people to get businesses that really flourish. And there's a mentoring side of it as well, and I've mentored people from the Trust that helps them to kind of really find their feet and to have somebody to call on if they're in any kind of trouble with, you know, where they are. So it's because it's so big what he's done. It's actually quite difficult to put into words what the King did with the Prince's Trust.
But it's helped, he has been so important in bringing some of these issues into the mainstream, in getting governments and corporates and others to understand this.
Julie, can I just interrupt you for a moment? Sorry, because this is Clarence House moving towards Buckingham Palace. This is the new king leaving. You can hear the crowd. Let's just listen to the crowd for a moment. Well, apologies for the quality of the picture and the intermittent. As we always say in here, you can go live to Kabul, but sometimes just down the road is a little tricky, but understandable perhaps given the circumstances. Now, you know, there is the new king leaving after this fascinating morning and returning to Buckingham Palace. Obviously, we saw him outside Buckingham Palace when he first arrived as king there yesterday, coming down from Scotland. We saw him getting out of the car. We don't actually expect him to do it again today, but we saw him getting out of the car yesterday, interacting with the crowd, sending, I think, a clear signal of how he would be doing business slightly differently. He seemed very pleased to be meeting people, and boy, did they seem pleased to be seeing him in person. But here we are after this day when we have seen ancient traditions in a slightly more modern context. First time we've ever seen inside an Accession Council. And here we are, Chris, quite big crowds. I mean, we expect the crowds to get bigger and bigger and bigger as the week goes on, but quite significant crowds of people here to watch the King return from the Accession Council to Buckingham Palace.
Yes, Tom, and I don't know what pictures you can see at the moment, but from where I'm looking down at Buckingham Palace, I can just see the King's Standard on top of the car there, going above the heads of the crowd. I'm trying to work out the direction in which he's going, because it doesn't look like he's going through the gates. No, he's doing a little turn, and then he'll go through the, I think that's called the North Centre Gate that he'll be going through. Just a short drive from Clarence House and St James's Palace, where all this morning's historic moments have been happening. The crowds, Tom, that they've clearly we've got a set of circumstances that are about to get underway here. And actually, yesterday, you remember, the crowds were able to sort of amass in front of Buckingham Palace. Today, they've all been held behind barriers, and I think this is probably going to be the case for the next week or so now, because we've got several events that are due to take place between now and, of course, the time of the time of the state funeral. And in terms of the state funeral, Tom, a couple of announcements that we've had this morning. One is that it will be a public holiday in all 4 nations of the UK, and whilst we expect it to be in about 10 days' time, and that would put us around perhaps Monday of next week, we're waiting for confirmation of that, and that kind of confirmation is the sort of thing that we might expect this afternoon. Why has the King gone into Buckingham Palace? Well, they told us earlier he's got a series of audiences, again with the Prime Minister. He's meeting Liz Truss once again, but this time with members of her cabinet. He's also seeing the Archbishop of Canterbury, the leaders of the opposition parties. They didn't specify which ones they were, but clearly Sir Keir Starmer, and we also know, because we've seen her this morning, that the First Minister of Scotland is here as well. So quite a busy afternoon for the new King, and as we've been discussing, this was always in the plan, and there is no time to wait. Monarchy continues, monarchy will always remain.
Do you know, Chris, I mean, what are we? We're not yet 48 hours, slightly lost track of time. You probably have too, into this process. And the thing I think that's most striking so far is the juxtaposition of so many emotions. The emotion we expected was to feel incredible sadness at the loss of the Queen. Somebody, you know, pretty much universally, if not universally admired, greatly loved by a vast number of people. Doesn't matter, we've rehearsed this, you know, in terms of having this discussion many times, but I think everyone watching this will know it doesn't matter how old someone might be, it doesn't necessarily lessen the shock or the grief when they go, and I think there's been a lot of that we've seen. Even if you expected it, it's still a tremendous shock. But at the same time, and we've seen it this morning, You know, it is undeniably emotional and, you know, quite exciting in its own way to see a new king. And I guess that's the bit, you know, we haven't witnessed that in our lifetime. So maybe that's the bit we didn't expect, you know, to see all this playing out, to see this man who's waited his whole life for this stepping up. I mean, that's a surprisingly emotional thing to witness, right?
Yeah, and I think the thing that we never knew for certain would happen was what kind of reaction he would get. I think because the focus was always on his late mother, the focus was always on the Queen and how long she had reigned and the commitment to the job and how young she was when she took the job. I don't think any of us really knew quite how the country, or the world even, would react to the arrival of a king at age 73. I think we're getting a bit of an answer here. It's clearly not the full picture, and there are people in the country right now who are neither watching this, they're neither here, and they're getting on with their normal Saturdays. But I think we're getting a bit of the picture in that there is a well of affection for him, given what he's been through. Let's just remind ourselves, it was only in the last, as you say, Thursday evening that they announced the death of the Queen. But that was only 18 months after the death of his father as well. He's lost both of his parents in a very short space of time. And as you say, you can prepare for that. You can know it's coming down the track. I don't think anything can really prepare you as an individual for the loss of both of your parents. But we're seeing, and we saw a bit with the walkabout yesterday, didn't we? We're seeing a kind of sort of quite natural affection for him and a sympathy for him as new king.
You talked a little bit about the order of business. The Prime Minister again and her cabinet, opposition figures. You know, you mentioned the possibility of meeting the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon. These are weighty matters. I mean, they're, you know, we're in the middle of a cost of living crisis. You know, we've heard that the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England is now not going to meet. There's some raised eyebrows at that, given, you know, the problems with rampant inflation and so on. So there is a huge amount going on. Business is crowding in. Can you just give us a sense of how, you know, how the week goes for him? He's suddenly got to step up to this very big job.
Yeah, but I'd agree with you there, Tom, because he will be absolutely focused on not just the job of new king, but actually that the country is facing a crisis, and we were talking about nothing else but that crisis up until about Thursday when we got this the news about the Queen's health. And he will be acutely aware that all the news this week has overshadowed what Liz Truss was announcing to the House of Commons in terms of that multi-billion-pound package to help people with their energy bills. And also I think there is that juxtaposition between everything that we're seeing here and the heraldry and the very archaic traditions that have been playing out, that kind of has brought us all back a few centuries. As beautiful as it is to watch, I think some people might point out the juxtaposition between the personal financial pressures that people have got coming down the track this winter and the fact that we have monarchy. And I'm sure there will be a debate in due course about the place of monarchy in our constitution. But there was an interesting point earlier, wasn't there, with the Accession Council, that he was there with his Privy Councillors. There are about 700 or so of them. They weren't all there at the time. But while he was there with his Privy Councillors, giving them his kind of allegiance to the constitutional democracy, we also had them all individually. We saw them, didn't we? David Cameron, Nicola Sturgeon, Ian Duncan Smith, Ed Miliband, signing their allegiance to him as well. I thought it was a two-way process. I think that's going to be very important.
OK, Chris, thank you very much indeed for now. Well, if you're just joining us, quite incredible scenes, I think it's fair to say, at St James's Palace and the City of London this morning. The first time we have seen this historic proclamation of a monarch televised, certainly in terms of the Accession Council inside. The new King, Charles III, arrived in that room full of key senior dignitaries, including the current and former Prime Ministers, to sign the proclamations. That ink pont, the one he was using, you can see here, a gift from his sons, William and Harry. He had just spoken to officially announce the death of his mother, the Queen. He talked of being consoled by the sympathy that had been expressed to him and his siblings for their loss. And he paid tribute, saying the Queen had given him an example of lifelong love and selfless service.
I, Charles III, by the grace of God, of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and of my other realms and territories, King, Defender of the Faith, do faithfully promise and swear that I shall inviolably maintain and preserve the settlement of the true Protestant religion as established by the laws made in Scotland in prosecution of the claim of right, and particularly by an act intituled An Act for Securing the Protestant Religion and Presbyterian Church Government, and by the acts passed in the Parliament of both kingdoms for union of the two kingdoms, together with the government, worship, discipline, rights and privileges of the Church of Scotland. So help me God.
Well, time-honoured that may be, but we've never seen it before, and how remarkable it was to do so. Studied, no doubt, by politics and history students for the rest of time. But let's go back to Rebecca Barry, who was at the Royal Exchange. Obviously, the proclamation, having been made outside St James's Palace, was then made again down in the city. And Rebecca, you were there, an incredibly colourful occasion.
Yes, and the crowds here fell silent, eager to hear every word of that proclamation as it was read from the steps of the Royal Exchange here. Silent until they all responded in unison, God save the King. Then they joined in the national anthem. I noticed a few people accidentally saying Queen instead of King, an understandable mistake to make, perhaps the first time they've ever sung those new words. Then there were 3 cheers for the King, which echoed around the buildings here at the Bank of England, Mansion House, the Royal Exchange. They had more than witnessed a moment in history, they were part of it. And I can speak to one of the members of the crowd here. Rachel, tell me how you felt seeing and hearing that moment.
It was amazing. It felt like we was watching and like in history, like a really historical day. It's like a new era for the country. It felt very weird to say, getting around your head around the King, like God save the King. But yeah, it felt a bit like I had goosebumps. It felt really special.
Tell me a little bit about the emotional and physical journey that you've been on in the last few days.
Yeah, on Thursday, obviously, we heard around lunchtime that the Queen wasn't well. But as minute I saw all the press and everyone getting into black and everyone going to Balmoral, you thought this is it. So I got down to Buckingham Palace and I got there just before the flag came down, and it was it was an emotional evening. You feel like, wow, this is really happening. And I really wanted to bring the kids today so they could see the pageantry and be part of history.
And how have you changed over those days from your presumably deep sadness, a feeling of sadness, to how you feel now towards the next era?
It's still quite a lot to take in. I don't really know how it's going to be a big adjustment. Everyone knew she was coming. Obviously, she was 96 years old, but didn't realise it would happen so quickly. Obviously, she only handed over Parliament Prime Ministers 2 days before, so it was a bit of a shock. But yeah, it's going to be a lot of changes, our currency, our post stamps, like so many things that I wanted to educate the kids on as well.
Yeah, your children will be growing up in a different era. What sort of king do you think that they will live under?
I think he's shown in the last couple of days the fact he's been on walkabouts, the fact that today was public for the first time, you can see it live on the telly, and the fact he went to show. I think he's going to open up. He seems like quite a personal king from what we've seen so far.
Thank you so much for sharing your experience.
Thank
and
you.
I hope you have a good rest of this very momentous, historic day. And I think from the people I've met and spoken to over the last few days, most were initially expressing obviously deep sadness about the death of the Queen, but today I have noticed a shift really as people start to look to the next era.
OK, Rebecca, thank you very much indeed. Well, it has been a morning in which we have seen the new King in action. True last night when he spoke to us, of course, but today going through the business that is now the meat and drink of his life, the business of being a constitutional monarch. We have 2 people here. I'm very pleased to say Joan and Dame Julia are still here, who know him very well. So can I just ask you simply, Joan, perhaps I can start with you. What kind of king do you think he'll be?
I think he'll remain the person he's always been. I think that's very important because the person he's always been, in my experience, is a very kind, compassionate, caring, somebody who's very, very interested in people. And the huge sense of duty, huge sense of service. And I think that will continue. I think if he deviates, it would be a little bit weird. You know, I think all he needs to be is be himself. And I think that's what he'll do. He'll be himself, and that's important.
You've been so involved in some of his charitable work. Do you think it will? I mean, I don't want to suggest he's going to give it up, because I'm sure he will have a vast interest in it, and I'm not quite sure. Perhaps you would know better than I do what the future of those arrangements are. But he will have less time for it, and it's been such a critical part of his life. I mean, is that going to be a wrench, do you think?
If I go back to what I said, he knew the boundaries of being a prince, and he knows the confines of being a king. So he'll know he'll know not to step over whichever mark it is. So, of course, you don't lose interest. He's not going to suddenly switch off and say, well, I'm not interested in young people who need help, and I'm not interested in giving people a hand up that need it. He's not going to do that. But he's not going to kind of get down and dirty, if I can put it like that. You know, he'll know that the boundaries that he needs to stay within. And that's all he can do, really. He, as I say, I can't really just repeat it. He knows what he needs to do, and he'll do the right thing.
Julie, what's your impression? I mean, just speaking about it really realistically now, we're in the middle of a cost of living crisis. This is, you know, a man who has spent quite a lot of his life, as Joan was just saying, talking with, you know, people who haven't had the best start, and he's been very instrumental in helping them through his charitable work. So he's going to come into this role at a time when the country is under extreme stress. A lot of people are under extreme stress, and he's going to have a meeting every week with the Prime Minister, and perhaps he will agree with what the Prime Minister is doing, and perhaps he won't. Perhaps he'll sometimes think that more could be done. I mean, you know him very well. How's your sense of how he'll manage that?
My sense, having worked with him for 40 years, as Joan has, is that he has prepared all his life for this role. And it has been touching and heartrending, really, to see him take it up with such dignity and solemnity and clarity about the importance as the sovereign. He's created his whole charitable activity and all his charitable empire has been about connecting people with each other, so business to meet communities, or with young people, with mentors, or with teach-firsters in schools with great head teachers. He's been a fantastic connector. He won't lose that ability, but he will be clear that the decisions now are decisions only to be taken by government. He will be incredibly curious, he always is, about where did that happen? Why is San Francisco managing homelessness better than we are? What is that very interesting thing I saw in Canada the other day? He's an immense soaker-upper of ideas and thoughts and energy and drives and inspiration.
I think it's important what you said, but having said that, it's not to say, and now I'll interfere now that I've asked that question.
No.
Again, because I think he knows the boundaries.
He will absolutely understand those boundaries, but his knowledge of what he's done and the things he's cared about will carry with him to infuse his inspiration and importance of what he can do to inspire the nation, actually, as well as everybody else.
But Joan, maybe one more question on this. I guess the point one might realistically have, or the question one might realistically have this morning, and this, you know, everyone loved the Queen, so let's just, you know, accept that absolutely as it was. The new king is his own person.
They're going to love the new king.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that's true. But I guess my question is, I mean, it may be that people want a little bit more sort of, not intervention in government, but maybe a bit more public emotion. It's possible that's something people will welcome, right? And that's the line he's got to walk, or you don't think so?
No, I don't think he wants to intervene more than he needs to, has to, a convention allows him to, and I don't think the public want that either.
Yeah.
They don't want confusion. They don't want, hang on, am I going to listen to the Prime Minister or am I going to listen to the King? They don't want that. We've gone through that. Space of stuff, you know.
Yeah.
She's King Charles III. We've done that.
Yeah,
we don't need to do that
again.
No, he's going to be involved. He wants to be involved. He's an intelligent guy. He knows what he likes. He knows his interests. As I said, he's interested in people. He's interested in politics. He's interested in climate change. He's interested in just about everything we have on this planet. but he knows boundaries. And I keep saying it because it's an important thing to know. It's important to know how far can I go. If I step over this mark, will I be causing confusion?
Okay.
I don't think he wants to cause confusion.
On that point, if we had Liz Truss here, just out of interest, what would you say? What would you tell her to expect? Because this, sorry, just to precurse this, one of the things we've talked quite a lot about in the last 48 hours is how important that relationship is. Because as Tony Blair has said, and a number of other prime ministers, it's lonely being prime minister, right? Who do you talk to? Like, everyone leaks, as Tony Blair said. The only person who doesn't leak was the Queen. So that relationship is quite critical. So what would you say if Liz Truss was here about how to get the best out of it?
I think, again, all she has to do is look at the man, because we know that the Queen had the knowledge and the experience and the years of being on the throne and years of kind of talking to different prime ministers over the years. But the King has had some of those experiences as well. So he's not coming in as a fresher. He's coming in with experience as well and knowledge. So people, when they talk to him, prime ministers, when they talk to him, they will get something out of it, and they will be able to talk to him, and he will be able to communicate back and help.
Okay.
He was always so influenced by Lawrence van der Post, who said that as you got older, you got wiser. And some of us on that side...
I'm not sure it's always working, but anyway, it works with you, I accept.
I think for the Prince of Wales, the experiences that he's had over 50 years means that his touring of the country and of the Commonwealth means that he has walked a lot of steps, which Liz Truss, as the new Prime Minister, has not yet walked. OK. Bob,
can I just ask you, we've talked a lot about the history. It's been fascinating, by the way. Thank you very much for your insights, not to mention explaining some stuff without which we would have had no chance of understanding the origins of all that. What's your reflection? Like, this is watching our constitutional setup in action in the most fascinating way. What's your sort of observation and actually having seen it this morning?
Well, I think the point struck me very much with these ceremonies, which, of course, are jolly carnival stuff in some ways, but also signify the length of our society, the whole history of this society. Whoever belongs to it, and the monarchy have been strong on this, Charles particularly, making sure that the guardsmen recruited everybody from our society, not just the ones they had habitually recruited from. And I think that was a very important influence and much to be welcomed. And I agree with what my co-sitters here have been saying about the Prince's trust. I think he has used his convening power as the Prince of Wales to a very good effect, and has particularly targeted people who otherwise would fall through the cracks of our society, and that's commendable. He will have to step back from that, as is said. And I hope the charities will continue. But they will be in other hands. There are problems about how the charities are funded, and we have to be alive to that. And he must not become involved in that at all as sovereign.
Okay. Now, so many people on the streets of London to come and feel part of this historic day. So it's been quite something to witness. These were the crowds outside St James's Palace, capturing the moment on their phones, and people clearly moved by what they were seeing. The crowds, indeed, bursting into song. Take a listen to this.
God save our King. Center victorious, happy and glorious, long to reign over us. God save the King.
And in the last few minutes, Charles III has arrived back at Buckingham Palace to more cheers from the crowds who'd gathered for a glimpse of the monarch. Our royal editor, Chris Shipp, was close by as that happened. Chris, the crowds really have come out today.
Yeah, no, Tom, to borrow and slightly abuse a phrase, I mean, there are, many decades when not very much happens, and then there are mornings when decades happen. And I think it's kind of what we saw here this morning with that Accession Council, the like of which we haven't seen since 1952, or a council that's never appointed a king since 1936. And then you were just playing some of the, some of this morning's moments. The crowd sort of spontaneously singing "God Save the King." Again, a reminder we haven't sung that as the national anthem since February 1952. And we were just discussing here in the last few minutes about the speech, the address he gave last night. It was faultless, and he started his reign, Tom, I think we will all agree, in the best possible way.
Chris, thank you very much indeed. It has been quite a morning. A major thank you to Bob and Joan and Julio for their amazing insights. And that is very sadly where we must come to the end of this special programme on a day when we have seen the new king proclaimed to his people. History made, it must be said, and the television cameras there for the first time to capture the key moments in that Accession Council. With his wife standing behind him, we saw King Charles officially sign the proclamation. The inkpot just in front of him was poignantly given to him as a gift by his sons, William and Harry. He had just spoken to officially announce the death of his mother, the Queen. He talked of being consoled by the sympathy that had been expressed to him and his siblings for their loss, and he paid tribute to the Queen, saying she had given him an example of lifelong love and selfless service.
My mother gave an example of lifelong love and of selfless service. My mother's reign was unequalled in its duration, its dedication and its devotion. Even as we grieve, we give thanks for this most faithful life.
Watching these iconic events unfold, some of the UK's biggest political figures, the current Prime Minister and former Prime Ministers, standing side by side today, deep in conversation, all political conflict put aside, as they remembered the Queen and looked to the future under a new monarch. Outside, on the streets of the capital, the crowds gathered to witness this momentous day, and at St James's Palace, there were cheers for the King.
3 cheers for His Majesty the King. Hip, hip! Hooray! Hip, hip! Hooray! Hip, hip! Hooray!
And in the last half an hour, we have seen King Charles III head back to Buckingham Palace to yet more crowds. Cheers, that is, from the crowd. The nation has a new monarch, and that message will be travelling far and wide to all the corners of the UK. Personally, I found it an absolutely fascinating morning. Thank you very, very much indeed for joining us.